And hello, everyone. Good evening and welcome to Tuesday and our new live read for the next little bit. Hello, everyone. Good evening. Welcome on in. My name is Tim Maloney. I am a professional narrator and do a lot of live reading here on the various channels and networks, highlighting indie authors and giving them a chance to shine. At the same time, I get the opportunity to practice my craft and read some fantastic stories along the way. If you've caught the last couple of streams, I was in a romance world. Romance, you say? But Tim, you don't look like the kind of guy to read romance. You know what? You're right. I'm not. It's not typically the genre that I would go out of my way to read. My wife, a very different story. She loves that genre. Tim likes fantasy, sci-fi, which is, of course, why I wrote a psychological thriller. You gotta love it. But it takes all kinds, and you gotta try all sorts of different things. And so that is what I have and what we're doing. This is more of a darker horror type of a read. What, Tim? A darker horror type of a read? Absolutely. In the words of our author, I've always been drawn to the darkness we try to deny. The Crucifix explores what happens when that darkness refuses to stay buried. And I'm thrilled to see it brought to life through this reading with Tim. That's right. I, of course, work with our indie authors to get them the chance to be showcased. Fun thing about indie authors, if this is your first time hearing any of this, I've said it once or twice or thrice or twice. I don't know what the fourth would be. I've said it a lot of times before, but excuse me. Indie authors have to do it all themselves. They are the writer. They are often the editor. They are the alpha reader, the beta reader, the proofreader, the publisher, and at the end of the day, the marketer. It is not an easy world to be a indie author, an indie author. And it is even harder to be a successful one. So I do my little part to give them this forum to showcase their books, especially those that don't already have audiobooks out there, because if they had an audiobook already, what do they need me for? I offer this free to the indie authors because, once again, it allows me to practice my craft at the same time as I am allowing them the opportunity to showcase their work to the world. That's right, everybody. Did you know that you are the world? Congratulations. Now, that brings me into the next point of topic before we get into the book. I record all of these live reads, and with the permission of the authors, I post them all to my YouTube channel. Which means if you miss any part of the reading, this one or any of the number of books that I have done, and you wanted to check out what you missed, you couldn't make it for 8 o'clock Eastern on one of my live read nights, youtube.com/@SirArminius is your spot to be able to go to check out what I have read and catch back up to where we are. You can, of course, stop out to Amazon and pick up the author's book. They would appreciate that. And hey, if you listen all the way through, go give them a review as well. You consumed the book. The least we can do is write them a little review about it, right? So because I record all of these, I am more than happy to chat with all of you However, the chatting must come between chapters. The chatting doesn't want to get recorded. We want the good stuff recorded. Not that chatting with you isn't good stuff, but we want it recorded. So, feel free to leave any of your thoughts, comments, anything else across the various channels, and I will be happy to respond to them as soon as I am able to. And if I am not able to, if I miss it, it's okay. I will try to catch them, though. Best place to interact with me, though, is through youtube.com/@SirArminius. It is the main channel that I do this on because I post them on, and it's where I pay the most attention to as we go forward. So, enough about what we're doing here and what we can do. Let's go ahead and get into the story. Written by Naomi Cashman, The Crucifix. So sit back, relax, and prepare to enjoy as we start another evening of storytime goodness with The Crucifix, read for you by Tim Maloney. And here we go, starting with Prologue. Come on, quickly. Get in here before you get soaked from the rain. Apologies, we're running a little behind schedule. We're just waiting for one more couple to arrive, and then we'll begin the tour. How's everyone keeping? Where are y'all from? At the guide's words, Malcolm headed directly to the dying fire nearby, trying to keep himself warm as he stood in the drafty, makeshift living room. He assumed the room had once been a drawing room for some of the more senior nuns, given how expansive it was. There were large windows to the right overlooking the cathedral at the front of the building and to the harbor in the distance. The gaudy, ornate marble fireplace sat in the middle of the room. The carpet, now faded, may have been a rich red color once, far too grand for anyone other than a senior nun. To Malcolm, the whole room just appeared sad and outdated. A few plastic fold-out chairs were the only items of furniture in the room, bar a pitiful self-crafted coffee station accompanied by a few milk jugs with unappetizing items floating in them. The large windows were murky and cracking, allowing the cold night air to enter, while black mold festered in the corners of the room. Malcolm sighed. Out of all the nights that she could have dragged him out, his mother had chosen tonight, the most miserable night they'd seen in October. And for what? To bring him to this decaying cesspool for fun? He couldn't remember the last time the weather had been this bad. The rain was torrential, causing flooding in the streets, and trees had collapsed beneath the gale-force winds. And his mother had decided that a tour of a convent next to the sea would be a great activity for them both to do. He shook his head and rubbed his hands together, blowing into them to try to get some heat circulating. Across the room, his pathetic, eager-eyed mother was talking animatedly with the tour guide, while nursing a cup of weak black coffee. Malcolm snorted. She doesn't even like the taste of coffee, he thought. She always said it was too bitter. Most likely, she had only taken the cup because everyone else had leapt at the invitation of a free hot drink. Malcolm rolled his eyes and turned to face the fire, focusing on the dancing flames and the crackling of the wood. His mother lived for this sort of thing. She loved to visit any old building with a gruesome history that was within a 5-mile radius. Usually he talked his way out of going with her, but his recent suspension from school and the string of warnings from the police meant that he was supposed to be under her constant watch. She didn't trust him to be on his own in case he acted out again, so he had no choice but to be on his best behavior. He hated the fact that his every move was constantly scrutinized, and he hadn't even done anything to warrant being treated like a prisoner. It was his friends who had made the bad decisions, not him. It wasn't his idea to lock the new kid in one of the lockers. He just happened to be there. And when he was called to the principal's office, he wasn't about to snitch on his friends. Unfortunately, his silence was taken as an admission of guilt, and he was lumped with the same punishment, suspended for the next 2 weeks. Not much of a punishment, he thought, smirking, before his expression darkened once more as he gazed into the flames. He was distracted from his thoughts by a sharp pinch on the exposed skin on the back of his neck, and his mother's harsh voice in his ear. "We talked about this, Malcolm," she half-whispered through gritted teeth. "You promised me that you would behave. Please, for the love of God, for the sake of one night, can you try to put a smile on your face and suck it up? I know you don't want to be here. You've made that crystal clear. But if you could just get over yourself for a few minutes, you might even learn something while you're here." Malcolm glanced up at her from under his eyelashes. Here we go again, he thought. He opened his mouth to stop the anticipated lecture, but she continued to speak, ignoring anything he had to say, as usual. "You know, no one even knows what happened to her," she said quietly, leaning in closer to him. "The string of murders just stopped, and it's like she fell off the face of the earth. She just disappeared, never to be seen again. No further records have ever been found. Isn't that just insane? I mean, it's as if—" "Who disappeared, Mum? What are you even talking about?" "Sister Catherine, of course. Who else would I be talking about?" She grabbed his arm and squeezed it hard, dragging him closer still. "And you know what's creepy about the whole thing?" she asked. He could feel her breath on his face, could practically taste the bitter coffee that she had downed only a few moments ago. "What's that, Mom?" Malcolm said in monotone. "The crucifix disappeared too, without a trace. So the cursed object could just be walking around this very town." "What crucifix are you talking about? A crucifix wouldn't be able to walk, Mother. Don't be stupid." His mother glared at him. Malcolm's blood ran cold. He wanted to shrink back into his hoodie. "You know what I mean, Malcolm. Come on now, the tour is starting." The group trudged up the creaky wooden stairs, swatting their way through the cascade of century-old cobwebs that adorned every crevice of the place. "This is disgusting," Malcolm thought. "You'd think they would have made an effort to clean the place." He swiped at his face, trying to remove an invisible web. After they had passed by a series of cramped, musty-smelling bedrooms, the guide asked them to gather in the narrow hallway to give them the next set of ominous facts. Malcolm thought he must have been new to the job. The young man fumbled with his handwritten notes, and sweat beaded his forehead despite the cold. The whole thing was quite comical. "Right here, ladies and gentlemen, is the dorm room that Sister Catherine occupied right up until she became the Reverend Mother of the Orphanage," the guide said, gesturing towards the room. "She was the very last person to ever occupy this room. Our records show that some of the orphans were terrified because of the strange events that used to take place here. They refused to reside in it, fearful that the devil would notice them. So the room was never used by anyone else until the closure of the orphanage over 100 years ago. It has remained untouched since that evil night when she allowed her nefarious tendencies to take control. Please, feel free to take a wander around the room, if you dare." Malcolm rolled his eyes at the tour guide's weak attempt to create a frightening atmosphere, and pushed past a few people to see inside the room for himself. It looked just like every other room in the dormitory he had passed by, mostly bare with very little furniture. He couldn't understand why everyone was falling over each other to try and take a photograph of the empty interior. The excited chatter from the tour group irritated Malcolm, so he decided to clarify why everyone was losing their minds. "So, what was the deal with this nun? She went mad and killed a few kids, was that it?" The rest of the group stopped their conversation short, eager to hear the dark tales of the notorious woman. "Malcolm," his mother whispered, her face flushed. "Don't interrupt the man." No, it's quite all right," said the guide with a subdued smile. "Many people don't know the story of Sister Catherine's life. You're right. She murdered the children who were in her care, brutally and viciously. She was a woman completely without mercy. Some statements we found in the notebooks written by a local priest named Father Michael suggest that Sister Catherine wasn't exactly human." The tour guide flexed his fingers in the air in awkward air quotes. "It's been said that she became obsessed with the idea of owning the crucifix, and, when she attempted to steal it for herself, a vicious darkness came over her and completely transformed her from the woman that everyone knew. There are many speculations as to whether this woman was clinically insane, but most of our records suggest that those around her believed the crucifix she coveted was cursed by the devil himself. Willing to commit a most grievous sin to obtain it, she fell into the hands of the devil, totally transforming her into a creature of darkness." Malcolm laughed in disbelief. He couldn't help it. It all sounded too far-fetched. He had seen too many horror films to be unable to pick out a bad storyline when he heard one. The guide nodded in understanding. "It's difficult to believe, I know. I didn't quite trust it myself at first." He grabbed a nearby chair, dusted it off with a tissue that he pulled from his coat sleeve, and slumped down into it. "Let me tell you the full story." There we go, guys. The prologue is done. So, I should have mentioned earlier, and I forgot to read the author's note as we started this. This story is inspired by the real-life setting of the Convent of Mercy in Cobh, Ireland. If you're wondering why I went with Irish accents for all of the characters, that would be why. Because we're set in Ireland, and what with all of the people being Irish, it just felt right for the accents to be Irish as well. Don't you think? I'm not wrong, am I? I don't think I am. Well, whatever are you gonna do, right? We'll find our way to enjoy it, no matter what way we spin it. All right, and I don't see any comments from anybody out there. I did forget to fix one other thing, and it's going to plague me through this entire thing, but I forgot to change the folder that these are being saved in. A good thing copy and paste exists, right? All right, guys, let's go ahead and jump back in. And we're going to start into 1865. As the rickety horse and trap rounded the narrow bend, the Convent of Mercy slowly came into view. The dark and gloomy November sky did nothing to help the appearance of the dilapidated convent. The windows were caked with dirt and enclosed by iron bars, as if trapping everyone inside like a prison. The crucifix, which stood at the top of the building, cast an ominous shadow across the lawn, demanding the attention of everyone in the vicinity. There was a row of religious stone statues overlooking the cathedral in the distance. Catherine recognized one of them as being Mary, the Virgin Mother. The original white paint of the statues was now dull, almost gray in color, and was peeling from age around the center of the faces. The distortion of the facial features made the figures almost unrecognizable and filled Catherine with a sense of unease as she looked up at them. She imagined that if the statues were able to feel anything, the sheer pain from the cracked faces would have been unbearable. She took a deep breath and looked around, trying to accept that this bleak place would be her home from now on. She had heard whispers in her village about this convent. This was the place to which all orphaned, troubled, and misunderstood souls were discarded when no one knew what to do with them. The convent kept them out of sight and away from the prying eyes of all the nosy villagers. They were placed into God's hands to allow their faith to show them the righteous path. At least, that's what she had heard. She'd known it had been only a matter of time before she would be forcibly sent here. Her mother, unable to accept her for who she truly was, had threatened her with it ever since she'd turned 14. She would call Catherine obstinate and deceptive, traits she found abhorrent. Catherine reflected on the few notable incidents that she'd been involved in where some people had got hurt, but that had been unavoidable. And of course, she'd told the odd lie here and there, but who hasn't? She wasn't perfect, but nor was she a troubled soul who needed to be saved. She sighed, then focused on her surroundings. She believed coming here was her destiny, but not so soon, nor because she'd become an orphan. She understood why people had once commented on the grandeur of the building. With the extensive grounds overlooking the town's harbor and the convent's wide-arched Gothic entrances and oriel windows, one could imagine the convent as an appealing place, one that Catherine wouldn't have minded being sent to. Now, it was a different story. Catherine pulled her threadbare shawl closer around her body, a futile attempt to try and keep some heat in her body, but the bitterly cold sea air made retaining any warmth impossible. The trap shuddered to an abrupt halt at the top of the steep hill, rolling back a few inches before the horse steadied himself. She took a breath, braced herself, and gingerly stepped down from the carriage, clutching her tattered case. A priest greeted her with a nod of his head and reached out to take her case from her, but offered no words of comfort. The sharp wind slapped her in the face like knives, and she had to fight to keep her hair from winding its way around her neck. She glanced around, her eyes darting in every direction, trying to take in the unsettling surroundings. The sudden sound of sharp heels clacking against the stone staircase at the entrance of the building drew her attention. Descending from the stairs was the tall, domineering figure of a young nun with her head held high. Catherine guessed from the woman's confident steps and the pristine, stiff habit that she wore that this was the Reverend Mother. She must have been in her early 30s at most, with dark, angular eyes that focused on Catherine with a piercing gaze. Her sharp features stood out against her pale, almost translucent skin. A shining gold crucifix hung on a chain around her neck, and Catherine couldn't help but stare. Its grandeur was dazzling. It appeared to be double-plated, with thick, curved lines forming the shape of the cross, and red jewels adorning the exterior. Catherine thought this was odd. She had never come across a nun who would be so brazen and expose skin on their neck to showcase such an obstinate item before. Normally, they wore the same simple, understated chain concealed beneath their habit, lest one be deemed vain. Why would she be wearing something so ornate? After she thrashed out this idea for a few moments, she brushed her confusion off. Perhaps a Reverend Mother was awarded more liberties, or maybe there were different rules for nuns in bigger towns. A wisp of dark hair had managed to escape from underneath the nun's veil. She had yet to utter a single word. Catherine stood in front of her, shaking as the nun scrutinized every inch of her. Catherine shuffled her feet in the awkwardness of the eerie silence. Ever since her parents' funeral a few weeks ago, everyone she came across had just stared at her. She hated it. She hated the deep pity in their eyes. She didn't want sympathy from anyone, and the silence from the nun reminded her of that dark time. She coughed into her hands and forced herself to look up and meet the nun's eyes. What she saw there made her stomach drop, and her cough died in her throat, almost as quickly as it had begun. An involuntary shudder racked its way through her body. There was something about the young nun's eyes, their darkness and the vast emptiness, that rattled Catherine to the bone. She had a gift for reading people, and she suspected this woman was someone to be feared. Finally, the nun spoke. "Welcome, child. I'm Sister Nora." Her smile was forced as she folded her arms across her chest. Catherine was surprised that her voice didn't sound like it belonged to her body. Given how young she looked, she had expected her voice to be soft and gentle, but there was a distinct guttural rasp to it, reminding Catherine of the time she had been forced to try her father's pipe. The incident had occurred late in the evening at her Uncle John's wake when the men were red-faced and blustering from drinking too much bootleg whiskey. The musty smell of smoke and aged sweat from men long overdue for a bath had invaded Catherine's senses. In the last few hours she had endured the tiresome charade of the men attempting to play the bodhran and tin whistle as a way of honoring John. She kept asking her mother if she could be excused, but each time her mother had shushed her and barked at her to show some respect for the dead. After a while the men, having grown tired of their musical session, moved on to the whole process of smoking their pipes. Her father, Dermot, spied Catherine in the corner with her sullen face and thought it would be funny if his little Cathy had a turn. Despite her mother's somewhat weak protests, Dermot was adamant as head of the house that he was to be obeyed, a sentiment wholeheartedly backed up by the remainder of the drunken fools in the room. Having no choice in the matter, Catherine took the pipe from her father's outstretched hand while everyone looked on in glee, nudging each other as if it was the most interesting thing they had seen in years. It was only after Catherine had inhaled the thick, earthy tobacco that she realized why they found the thought of her smoking it so amusing. Her chest heaved and she coughed and spluttered as the smoke escaped from her mouth in short bursts. She thrust the pipe back to her father, who was bent double with laughter, then ran for a cup of water to wash away the taste. Her throat ached for days after, and she would never forget the raspy timbre of her voice. The sound of Sister Nora clearing her throat brought her back to the depressing reality. "I do hope you'll feel at home here. Our routine may appear somewhat unorthodox at first, but don't worry. I'm confident that you will adapt soon enough, as all our children have." Her gaze shifted to Father Michael in front of her. "Thank you, Father Michael. You can go now." It appeared as if Father Michael was well used to the ways of Sister Nora, as he gave her a curt nod in acknowledgment of his dismissal. Catherine thought that he was in his 60s, but his morose demeanor made it difficult to guess his true age. His face was deeply creased, giving the impression that he held much pain and sadness. The priest placed her case at her feet. He squinted at Catherine with a deep frown before shuffling towards the chapel that stood next to the orphanage. As Father Michael climbed the stairs at the entrance to the chapel, he glanced over his shoulder, sneaking a look back at the pair. Sister Nora was standing directly in front of the young orphan. Catherine cowered with fear as she craned her neck to look up at the intimidating nun in front of her. The poor child had no idea of her fate. None of the children did. "It didn't used to be like this," he thought as he entered his office at the back of the chapel and lit a nearby candle. The convent used to be a place where lost souls would find the righteous path and become whole again. But now it was shrouded in a malevolent darkness. A strong presence of evil emanated from within Sister Nora, and he sensed it was growing more powerful as the years went by. As he sat down at his writing desk, he dropped his head into his hands in resignation. He longed for the young Nora who he had grown fond of when she was first being trained in the sisterhood. She had been warm and bubbly, the type of woman he could confide in. If there was ever a problem, she volunteered immediately to help. She took great pride in her work and was dedicated in her preparation to give herself fully to the Lord, focusing solely on completing her training. He thought about one time when they'd been working in the communal garden together on a crisp autumn evening. Their hands were blue and numb with the cold, and despite how eager Father Michael had been to postpone the work until the weather improved, Sister Nora would have none of it. She insisted, with a smile on her face, that they were helping the less fortunate by providing them with the produce from their hard work, so they must find the strength to persist. She even suggested that if they worked faster, they wouldn't feel the cold as much. He missed that Sister Nora, the Nora who was his friend. But that woman was long gone. Her body might still be there, but her soul had died long ago. An empty vessel occupied by a dark force remained in her place. He reached deep into his pocket and pulled out his string of rosary beads and prayed with all his might for the soul of the woman he once knew and loved. Well, guys, what do you think so far? Is the story interesting? Worth listening to? Worth hearing more of? It's clearly going to go dark somewhere. Are you ready for it? I believe I am. And so, after a brief sip of liquid sustenance, because of course, when you read, you've got to liquidate? That's not the right word. Hydrate. Hydrate is the word. And then we can continue. Remember, you are free to leave your comments, and I am happy to get to them. If you do have any questions, comments, anything else, I am happy to reply, as long as we are between chapters. Which we are at the moment, so let me check really quick. But I am not seeing any comments, any thoughts, questions, or concerns from anybody. So, that being the case, let us continue with 2. Father Michael's sudden departure meant Catherine was alone with Sister Nora in the front garden. She opened her mouth to speak, but Sister Nora cut her off. "You may only speak when spoken to," she said, then briskly turned on her heels and beckoned Catherine to follow her through the darkness into the orphanage. Much to Catherine's dismay, the inside of the building was no better than its grim exterior. The corridors were drafty and the walls were wet from condensation due to the lack of proper ventilation. There were a few faded photographs hanging on the walls, along with some moth-eaten tapestries. The ragged fabric made the symbols that were sewn on them difficult to decipher, but she managed to recognize the crossed keys of the disciple Peter on one of them. Why bother even hanging them up, she thought. If they're so worn, you don't even know what you're looking at. Sister Nora led her through a narrow stone corridor, passing several children who were hard at work with dusters and wet rags, removing cobwebs and grime from the pictures and walls. They kept their eyes lowered, focused on their chores. Most of the children were covered in dust and dirt themselves, and their faces were an alarming shade of gray, as if they hadn't washed themselves in months. None of them attempted to offer her a comforting smile or a greeting, making her feel even more apprehensive about what her life was going to be like here. Sister Nora led Catherine by weak candlelight up to a winding wooden staircase to her room, which was to be her home for the next few years. The minuscule candle flickered, creating monstrous shadows on the walls that Catherine imagined were trying to reach out and devour them. Swallowing her fear, she kept her eyes firmly on the floorboards, trying not to focus on the eerie surroundings. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, they arrived at a small open door. "This is your room," Sister Nora said with a brief jerk of her head, gesturing for Catherine to proceed inside. The room itself was dingy and sparsely furnished. It smelt stale, as if it had been quite some time since someone had last stepped foot in there. The wooden floorboards were quite aged and creaked under the strain of each movement, threatening to give way beneath her. The only furniture in the rooms were two narrow single beds on each side, a thin moss green blanket, and a small writing desk against the wall on the right-hand side. Catherine gripped her case tightly as she stepped into the room. She swept her hand across the blanket on the bed. The coarse fibers sent a shiver down her spine. The window on the far side of the room was covered in a mixture of dust and condensation that had developed into a thick layer of grime. She tugged the sleeve of her dress over her hand and wiped it across the window so she could gaze out. She wondered if she'd be able to see the cathedral spire in the town on a less foggy day. Sister Nora had stood silently on the threshold of the door while Catherine took in her minimal surroundings. Now, from the corner of her eye, Catherine noticed the nun seemed agitated. She fiddled with the crucifix around her neck and kept clenching her jaw, as if she was in pain, but her face remained unchanged. Uncertain how to react to the nun's strange behavior, Catherine turned back to the bleak scene outside her window. She noticed for the first time a small Gothic graveyard adjacent to her room. A ripple of fear swept through her at the thought of sleeping next to a graveyard. She jumped when Sister Nora suddenly appeared beside her, leaned down and whispered in her ear, "You know, none of our forsaken children ever truly leave us." The woman's breath was icy against the skin on Catherine's neck, and she shuddered. She glanced at the nun and frowned, puzzled by the absurdity of her words. But Sister Nora's attention was focused on the caretaker outside, who was struggling with a battered wheelbarrow covered by a dark tarp. As Catherine watched, the blood drained from her face. A small, pale hand dangled over the side of the wheelbarrow. That was why the caretaker had been exerting so much effort. He was moving a body. Desperate to get away from the horror of what she had just witnessed, Catherine backed away from the window. She could barely muster the courage to glance at Sister Nora, who had made her way back to the door. The nun's nonchalance terrified Catherine, and she was too afraid to speak. Sister Nora smirked. "Our children never leave us," she reiterated before slamming the door behind her. What sort of nefarious place is this? Catherine thought, as she slumped down on her bed in despair. That is just the kind of place you want to be as an orphan, right? Musty, grimy, condensation everywhere, dull, dingy, people that don't want you to speak. Perfect environment for a child. Or maybe not. I guess we find out more as we venture our way into 3. Later that evening, after what felt like a lifetime, Catherine was pulled from her tumultuous thoughts by the sound of a shrill bell ringing. She quickly rose from the bed, cracked open the door, and peered outside to see where the noise was coming from. All the orphans were moving in unison towards the staircase. One of the young girls jerked Catherine into the line next to her. "We're meant to head down to the dining room for dinner when the bell rings," she whispered. "My name is Rose, by the way. You can sit next to me if you like." Catherine smiled in gratitude as she quickly fell into step with the rest of the orphans. She glanced over at Rose, trying to guess her age. Her willowy physique and sunken face made it difficult to gauge how old she was, but she thought she must have been a little younger than herself, perhaps around 12 years old. Her matted blonde hair lay in a tousled mess on top of her head, as if it hadn't been combed in years. Catherine noticed some faded red marks on her forearm and wondered what had happened to her. Rose must have caught her gaze because she tugged the sleeve of her frock down to cover the marks. She looked up at Catherine, her blue eyes wide with alarm, and offered her a nervous smile as if to say, "Don't worry about it." Catherine managed to curl her lips into a forced grimace in return. Those marks on Rose's arm told a story which they couldn't talk about now, but Catherine was determined to find out the reason for them. The girls descended into the dining room, their movements almost robotic as each girl moved with purpose to stand behind the bench seats. They waited in silence, eyes downcast, hands clasped behind their backs. The air was thick with apprehension. A few minutes later, following the delicate chime of a bell, the heavy double doors of the room opened once again, and in marched a procession of nuns. Their black habits bustled with each step as they made their way to the head table at the front of the room. None of the nuns glanced at any of the children. Their faces were equally as stoic and unmoving as Sister Nora's, but Catherine had noticed one nun, who seemed older than the rest, heave her shoulders as if she had been holding her breath. She glanced up and caught Catherine's eye for a fleeting moment as she moved forward. This nun appeared different from the rest. Her movements were slower and more hesitant. Her face was quite personable, and there were smile lines on her face. But her eyes held such a vast amount of fear that Catherine herself became nervous. She quickly dropped her gaze and looked down. Once the nuns were seated, the orphans were permitted to sit. Sister Nora, who swept in at the back of the procession, squinted at each child as she floated up to the head table and sat down in the vacant seat in the middle. She raised her right hand, and, as if on autopilot, the orphans began to say grace. Bless us, O Lord, and these thy gifts, which we are about to receive from thy bounty. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. As soon as they were finished saying grace, Sister Nora once again raised her hand, and everyone but Catherine began to devour the questionable meal that had been placed in front of them. Catherine eyed the thick, muddy mixture of gray meat and limp vegetables with distaste. The thought of eating it made her feel nauseous. She gazed around the room until her eyes landed on the top table. Like the orphans, every nun was silent, eyes focused on their bowls. All except one. Sister Nora sat staring blankly into space as she clutched the crucifix around her neck. As she pulled on the crucifix, the chain moved, revealing puckered, jagged red lines marking the skin beneath. Catherine gaped. The wound looked excruciating, but Sister Nora showed no hint of pain, even though the more she pulled on the chain, the deeper the injury she was causing herself. As Catherine watched, Sister Nora's pulling action escalated, becoming erratic. She appeared to have trouble breathing, and beads of sweat began to form on her forehead. Catherine looked around in disbelief. None of the girls took any notice. They were too concerned with finishing their own meals. She wanted to scream at Sister Nora to stop, but knew she would risk being punished for speaking out of turn. There was no way she wanted to be on the receiving end of Sister Nora's anger. Suddenly, Sister Nora dropped the crucifix, and it fell back against her chest. As if she had heard Catherine's thoughts, her eyes darted upwards and locked directly with Catherine's, piercing her with a malevolent stare. She smirked, as if she was taking pleasure causing terror in the young girl. Catherine wanted to look away, but found she couldn't. It was like she was frozen in place, having no choice but to succumb to the fear. Sister Nora placed both hands on the table in front of her, leaning forward as if trying to get closer to Catherine. The smirk deepened. Darkness began to close in on Catherine. The room was becoming blurry, and she felt dizzy. Without warning, the sound of metal crashing against the wooden floors echoed throughout the room, breaking the spell between Catherine and Sister Nora. Everyone stopped, forks frozen in midair. I'm so sorry, sister. I never intended to. The young orphan who had dropped her fork stammered. Catherine craned her neck to the side, trying to get a better view of the child, who was visibly trembling now. She sneered a little. She knew she should feel sorry for the girl, but she couldn't stop her unkind thoughts. How pathetic! So anxious over a dropped fork. The girl was still pleading. I'm sorry, she said. It won't ever happen again. I swear, sister. Please don't hurt. She stopped short, biting her bottom lip as though regretting her words. Catherine raised her eyebrows in surprise. The girl sitting next to the unfortunate orphan started to move away from her, as if eager to create as much distance as possible between them. This only motivated the girl to beg for forgiveness so fast that her words were lost in a string of garbled noise. Catherine was shocked to find she wanted to chuckle at the absurdity of it all. "Christine, come see me after lights out tonight," Sister Nora barked at the girl, then slapped the palm of her hand against the table, causing the water glasses to vibrate, and everyone went right back to eating. The young girl's face went white, as if every ounce of blood had suddenly been drained from her body. Catherine couldn't understand how Sister Nora's few words could have that much of an effect on her. Bewildered, she stole a glance at Rose, hoping for an explanation, but Rose offered nothing in return. Instead, she brought her index finger up to her lips, indicating that Catherine was to remain silent, then bent her head over the table. Looking around the room, Catherine saw that every other girl had done the same. She assumed they were eager not to draw any unwanted attention to themselves. The young girl began to cry silently, her whole body shuddering with the effort of remaining quiet, but no one came to her aid. A heavy air of fear pervaded the dining room. Catherine didn't need to look up again to know Sister Nora was still watching her. She could feel her eyes boring into the side of her face. The next morning there was an empty spot at the table where the girl had sat the evening before. Everyone acted as if nothing had happened, as though she'd never been there in the first place. Well, this is a creepy-ass orphanage. I suppose that's what you get from a nasty, ugly type of an orphanage back in the day. The setting of a horror. So, I guess we just continue, shall we? As we move into 4. Catherine was baffled by everyone's willingness to keep up the pretense that Christine never existed within the walls of the convent. She needed to clear her head, so after her chores were done, she decided to go for a walk around the freezing cold grounds. A gust of wind hit her face as soon as she stepped across the threshold, but considering the insanity that was penetrating the convent, she figured that some icy weather was nothing compared with what was happening inside. She trudged along the gravel path, her nose growing red and her teeth chattering from the cold morning air. She wrapped her shawl tighter against her body as she approached the small graveyard that she'd seen from her bedroom window. Thinking she could bypass the resting place of the dead, she increased her pace but stopped when she noticed 2 small figures huddled together inside the graveyard. They were too far away for her to recognize them, but her curiosity got the better of her and, before she knew it, she was opening the gate and heading in their direction. As she got closer to them, she noticed that their grimy faces were stained with tears, and they were gripping one another. She wasn't sure if they were trying to keep warm or finding solace in each other's company. "What are you doing?" Catherine asked as she drew near. "You're going to freeze to death just standing here, you know." Startled by Catherine's sudden appearance, both girls jumped away from each other, struggling to stay upright in the dense mud in which they were standing. "What do you think you're doing, sneaking up on us?" one of the girls hissed at her. "You nearly scared us half to death." Catherine's mouth fell open, surprised by this serious overreaction to her arrival. The girls looked a little older than her, around 16, she guessed. She recognized their faces from dinner the evening before. "You're the new girl, Catherine, aren't you?" the other girl asked. Catherine thought this girl was the more approachable of the two. Her massive curly auburn curls whipped around her face, and she struggled to keep the strands from getting in her eyes. She was wearing a worn gray frock with a neckline that was curling from age, allowing Catherine to see a scattering of bruises across her upper chest. The varying colors of yellow and purple showed that some were more recent than others. "I'm Lauren, And this is Grace, she said, gesturing to the other girl, who was still glaring at Catherine. What do you want? Grace barked and folded her arms across her chest. Clearly, this girl had no interest in being civil towards her. Catherine narrowed her eyes at Grace's gruff tone as she scrutinized her. Grace's gaunt face and sunken eyes did very little to help her appearance. With her pale complexion, she resembled a ghost. Her hair looked like it had been roughly shaven off. Some patches were thicker than others, and some were so closely shaven that her scalp was red and raw in parts. Deciding not to anger Grace any further by commenting on her odd appearance, Catherine addressed her previous question with an exaggerated eye roll as if to say, Isn't it obvious? I was just out walking, and I saw you both. I wanted to see what you were doing, standing here in the graveyard. We're saying goodbye to Eofi, Thorin said. She bent down and placed a handful of thistles on the grave behind her. Catherine stifled a laugh. You know those are weeds you're putting on the grave. They're not flowers. She moved closer to the small headstone, ignoring Grace's perpetual glare. She read the name that was etched upon it. Eofi Crowley. The earth around it looked freshly dug. Eofi must have only passed recently. Lauren blushed and gazed down at her feet. We don't have anything else to put on her grave, she murmured, before looking back at Catherine. The thistles kind of look like flowers. At least, that's what Eofi always used to say. What happened to her? Catherine asked. What do you think happened to her? Grace cried. It's the same thing that happens to everyone here after a while. It's her. She just... Hush, Lauren said as she placed her hand across Grace's mouth. Don't say any more. She looked around in panic. You know she can hear you. She can hear everything. The wind suddenly ceased as Lauren uttered those words. It was as if everything around them stood still, afraid of making even a decibel of noise. Who are you talking about? Catherine asked. Her hands began shaking. Whether from the cold or apprehension, she wasn't sure, but she clenched them into fists to try to stop the tremors. Grace pushed Lauren's hand away from her face and rubbed her mouth in disgust before spitting on the ground. Don't put your hand on my mouth, she shouted. You know that she needs to know. And she gestured in disdain at Catherine. Lauren looked at Catherine with wide eyes. Her chin started to tremble as she struggled to stop the onslaught of tears that threatened to come. She glanced around again before shaking her head in defeat and beckoning for Grace to continue. Grace nodded her head at her, welcoming the opportunity to continue her explanation. It's Sister Nora. After a while, everyone meets their demise at her hand. We don't know why, but even if we do everything right, nor draw any attention to ourselves, it doesn't matter. Everyone's fate is sealed. She submits us to horrendous abuse, sometimes for days at a time. It becomes so unbearable that sometimes you just wish it would all end, and you beg for God to make that happen. But it never does. God never answers our pleas. Only the lucky ones, like Eofi here, get to escape the hell we're living in. Grace rubbed her head and winced. Lauren reached out and rubbed her arm in sympathy, but Grace shrugged her off. Is that what happened to your head? Catherine asked. Grace folded her arms across her chest and huffed. Well, I didn't do it to myself now, did I? Like I said, everyone gets the same treatment, so you'd best prepare yourself for what's to come. If you're lucky, you'll only have to endure it for a short time before you end up like Eofi. Grace took Lauren's arm and pulled her away, leaving Catherine alone in the graveyard to absorb what she had just been told. Is no one safe here? She wondered. Ah, the devil has come to the convent, and poor Eofi. I don't know if that's actually how that's pronounced, but hey, it worked for me. Poor Eofi. She found herself on the wrong end of Sister Nora and has died. That is the kind of thing that does happen in this sad, sad world they find themselves in. But now let's check through really quick for any comments. Oops. Unmuted a tab. Didn't need to unmute a tab. I see no thoughts, no questions, no comments, no concerns, no anything from the peanut gallery. So let us continue, shall we? As we move ourselves along in the story, find out more about what Naomi Cashman has in store for us with the Crucifix as we start into 5. A few weeks later, after dinner one night, the orphans walked in unison back to their dorm rooms as usual. The only sound was the rhythmic thudding of footsteps as each orphan walked in sync with each other. The line of girls grew shorter until only Catherine was left to return to her room. One of the nuns always followed the orphans to lock them in their rooms. Rose had explained that as soon as the 11 o'clock bell rang, they were all expected to say a decade of the rosary before going to bed. Tonight, Catherine rushed to change into her nightdress and gingerly knelt at the side of her bed. The floorboards were hard and cold against her knees, but she tried not to focus on that too much as she swayed from side to side to try to alleviate some of the pain. She took out her rosary beads and had just managed to half-heartedly whisper her way through a verse of Hail Mary when the wooden latch on her bedroom door swung open and hit the wall from the sheer force used. Every girl's room had a hatch on the door. They had been created by Sister Nora herself so she could look in on the orphans. Catherine had heard the other nuns say that it was for their own safety, so they could check on the girls to make sure they were all right. However, everyone knew it was due to Sister Nora's desire for complete control. Every one of the orphanage's processes was governed by control. The hatches let Sister Nora check that the orphans were following her commands, even in their isolated moments. Instead of feeling safe in the confines of their rooms where they should be able to rest from Sister Nora's grueling schedule, their privacy was invaded. Even in their most private moments, she could easily single out those who were being lax in obeying her demands. Luckily, by now Catherine was well used to the tyrannical nature of Sister Nora. She had been caught slacking in her prayers during her first few weeks in the convent and knew never to make the same fatal mistake again. Remembering that night made Catherine suddenly feel cold. She had been so preoccupied with her own thoughts that night, trying to make sense of why everyone was always so on edge, that she hadn't heard the bell ring. When Sister Nora came around for her usual inspections, Catherine hadn't been kneeling at the side of her bed as she should have been. In an instant she learnt the answer to the question that had been dominating her mind. Was no one safe here? Sister Nora, staring through the hatch with a face like thunder, declared that she was to follow her to her office at once, and she unlocked the bedroom door. Catherine shuffled along the dark, ominous hallway behind Sister Nora toward her private office. She couldn't remember the last time she had been in such close proximity to the head nun, other than her very first day at the orphanage. Sister Nora preferred to keep a watch over the orphans from a distance rather than engaging directly with them, so the fact that Catherine was on her own with this woman terrified her to her very core. Sister Nora swung open her office door and stood aside for Catherine to enter. It took a few moments for Catherine's feet to move again, so Sister Nora pushed her roughly over the threshold, causing her to stumble into the room. Catherine shivered as she stood in front of the wooden desk in the middle of the room. Sister Nora had given her no chance to change out of her nightdress, and the icy cold night air made her bones rattle. The nun sat down behind the desk and relaxed back into her chair, giving the impression that she was completely at ease. She tapped her fingers one by one on the wooden desk, and a chilling smile appeared on her face as she stared at Catherine. Finally, she broke the silence. "You forget your place, girl," she barked. "You are here because you are utterly alone in this world. You're here because you have no one. And yet, even though you're barely in the door, you feel as if you can disobey my rules. Why is that?" Sister Nora paused and sprang up from her seat. "You think you're better than the rest of the orphans, don't you, Catherine? This cannot go unpunished." She let out an exaggerated breath, shook her head, and walked towards an aged brown cabinet at the side of the room. She opened its heavy doors and pulled out a thin writing crop. Catherine swallowed. Her mouth had gone dry. Sister Nora continued, "My rules will always be followed here because, within these walls, I am the only power, the only God you need to know." She switched the crop back and forth as she circled Catherine. "Raise your nightdress above your knees and repeat after me. I am alone. I am alone." Catherine's breath hitched as she felt the sharp lash of the crop hit the back of her knees. The sudden shock of the pain made it impossible for her to speak. "Again!" Sister Nora shouted as she sliced the crop through the air, her voice becoming shrill as she shouted at her. "I am alone," Catherine stammered through gritted teeth. "I have no one," Sister Nora snarled while hitting her again. The stinging on the back of her legs made it difficult to concentrate on repeating the words back to her verbatim. Tears threatened, but Catherine fought hard to hold them back. She wouldn't give Sister Nora the satisfaction of showing her pain or that her words and actions were upsetting her. She had to see this ordeal through until Sister Nora had had enough of inflicting her abuse. "I have no one." Crack. "I am alone." Crack. The sound of the crop cracking against her skin oddly gave Catherine something to focus on rather than the physical pain. She had managed to disassociate herself from the agony ripping through her body and focus her mind on counting each time the crop whipped the back of her knees. She wasn't sure how much time passed before Sister Nora finally threw the crop onto her desk. She was gasping for air from the exertion of wielding the crop with such pressure against Catherine's skin. Catherine forced herself to glance up at Sister Nora, whose face was flushed with anger. A vein bulged from the side of her neck, indicating that the nun was still furious with her. Clearly, carrying out Catherine's punishment had done little to minimize her aggravation. Despite the sheer amount of pain coursing through her body, Catherine surprised herself by returning the nun's cold stare, thinking, "You want to break me? To wear me down like all the other orphans? To see me cry and beg? But I'm not like the other pathetic urchins in this place. I refuse to let you win." And she glared at her in defiance. Sister Nora's eyes narrowed, and she recommended whipping Catherine but with increased speed, strength, trying to make her crumble. When she stopped a short while later, she leaned down and whispered into Catherine's right ear, her husky breath making the hair on the back of Catherine's neck stand up. "I told you before, none of our children ever truly leave us. You would do best to remember that." She straightened her back and returned to her desk. "You are nothing in this world, Catherine," she declared, while toying with the chain on her neck. "Let this be your first and final warning. You will obey my word." And she dismissed Catherine with a flick of her hand. Catherine hobbled her way back to her room, closing the door with a gentle push behind her. Finally, she let the tears pour out as she tentatively rubbed the backs of her knees. The skin was swollen and raw. It would be at least a couple of days before she would be able to walk without wincing from the pain. She turned and slammed her hands against the wall in anger. Every step she took until then would be a constant reminder of the wrath of Sister Nora. A reminder that she was always watching and waiting for one of the girls to make a mistake so she could abuse them in some way for her own sick entertainment. Catherine threw herself onto her bed and sobbed uncontrollably into her arms. What was to happen to her here? As she lay in bed later that night, her mind replayed the heinous event that had occurred. Her active mind and the pain from her wounded skin was preventing her from sleeping. It must have been close to around 3 in the morning, she guessed, when she felt a low vibration which disrupted her tired train of thought. She couldn't work out what was causing it, but it seemed to be coming from right underneath her. Gingerly, she crept towards the door, but the vibration lessened. Next, she tried lying flat on the ground and pressing her palms against the floorboards. There it was. She could feel it perfectly from that angle. She frowned, but then it dawned on her. The chapel was located under her room, which meant the vibration could only have been coming from somebody playing the organ. But who, at this early hour, and why? She crawled back into bed, her mind buzzing with this new information. Eventually, thanks to the constant hum from below, Catherine managed to drift off to sleep. She slept heavily, her dreams filled with images of a shining crucifix and a lonely chapel. Ah, the darkness of Sister Nora. You've got to love it. We continue with 6. The following morning, yet another questionable meal of murky-looking porridge. The orphans were laboring in the gardens. Catherine's hands smarted from the scratchy shrubs she was tending. She leaned back on her heels and turned to Rose, who was weeding the section next to her. Rose, I think someone was playing the organ in the chapel in the early hours. There was a strange vibration coming from below my room. The blood drained from Rose's face. Her hand shook and the weed she'd been clutching tumbled to the ground. Shh! Don't say anything else. You're going to get us both in trouble, she whispered, and scrambled to pick up the fallen weeds. Why would we get in trouble for talking? Catherine asked. We're not doing anything wrong. Rose glanced at the other girls before lowering her voice further and saying, I don't know what you want me to say, Catherine. Strange things happen here. Sometimes they just can't be explained. It's safer for you and everyone if you stop trying to find answers. Catherine thought for a moment, but fear or no fear, she needed answers. She pressed Rose again. Just tell me the truth, and I won't ever bring it up again. I need to know what is going on here. Rose looked at her and shook her head in exasperation. Catherine felt a twinge of guilt for making the other girl uncomfortable, but thought she saw a glimmer of understanding in Rose's eyes. Perhaps she was beginning to win the young girl over. She bent over her patch of garden again, hoping to look busy and to placate Rose. She spoke from the side of her mouth so no one would realize they were talking. Surely you must have felt it too, Catherine pleaded. I mean, your room is right next to mine. Rose shook her head in denial. The only thing I hear at night is Emma snoring from across the room. Catherine scoffed in frustration. Rose really wasn't giving in easily. Through gritted teeth, she said, Look, Rose, enough is enough. I don't believe you. Strange things are happening here, but there must be a logical explanation. Everything points to Sister Nora, and you wouldn't be so scared if you didn't have the answers. Please, just be honest with me. We both have to live here. I need to know what's happening too." Rose looked at Catherine, eyes wide with fear. Her shoulders slumped, and she gestured for Catherine to continue with her task. "Okay, I'll tell you what I know, but at least make it look like you're working." Rose sighed and pushed a strand of hair out of her eyes before continuing. "There was a girl here a few months ago," Rose said. "I think they called her Ashlyn or something, and she heard things in the night too that no one else ever did. She felt like she was going crazy. She went to Sister Nora after the 6 o'clock service one evening, even though the girls warned her against it." Rose paused and looked around, making sure they were still not drawing any unwanted attention. "Why?" Catherine asked. "You know very well what happens when you're alone with Sister Nora in her office. You're not the only one walking around with healing wounds." Rose took a deep, steadying breath before she went on. "Nobody saw Ashlyn again after her meeting with Sister Nora. All her things were gone from her room the next day. It's like she never existed here. None of the other nuns would even speak of her. That's why you're the only one who has a spare bed in your room. That's where Ashlyn slept." Catherine spent the next few days trying to find out more about the other girls, but they remained tight-lipped. Whenever she tried to approach the subject, their eyes would flash with fear, and they would stutter excuses about needing to be somewhere else. They began to either avoid her or look at her as if she was going mad. They would whisper amongst themselves, glancing over at Catherine, making her feel like an outsider. It appeared that Sister Nora's wrath had successfully bought their silence, leaving the nun full rein to continue operating under a shroud of mystery. Yet Catherine didn't give up on her mission to find answers. One morning, lost in thought about who else in the convent she might ask, the cathedral bells rang to signify midday. She hadn't even noticed the morning slipping away from her. As she looked up from her work and wiped away the sweat dripping from her brow, she caught a glimpse of Father Michael blessing a local woman by the chapel doors. He was scheduled to carry out confession throughout the course of the day. He caught Catherine staring at him and offered a warm yet fleeting smile and walked back into the chapel. His friendly smile gave Catherine a little sliver of hope. Perhaps he might be able to help her. Catherine had been known in her hometown as cunning. Too wise for her age was what they used to say about her. She always knew how to get what she wanted, and she knew well enough that as Father Michael was a well-established clergyman, he was bound to silence by his vows. Whatever she would say to him would remain confidential. She thought about her mother's words many years ago as she was preparing for her first confession. "What is said between a priest and a parishioner during confession is sacred. Anything you tell him is private, is between you and God. The priest is just the middleman. He has taken a vow of secrecy that cannot be broken." A vow of secrecy is very useful in this case, she thought. And so she decided that after lunch she would go to confession to speak with Father Michael. Really, what is there for her to confess to? Here she is living in the convent. There's no opportunity for sin. Right. All I know for sure is... We continue. We proceed on with 7. When she walked into the cold, drafty chapel that afternoon, Father Michael was already concealed within the confines of the confessional box. Catherine sighed with relief as his concealment bought her a few more moments of anonymity. Her stomach knotted in anxiety. Would he recognize her voice as soon as she spoke? She couldn't think about that possibility now. The sheer desire for answers heavily outweighed any thought of not going through with her plan. She pulled back the heavy red velvet curtain and stepped inside the narrow space. Her heart thumping in her chest, she knelt on the pew and took a deep breath to steady herself. The curtain was so thick that as soon as she pulled it shut behind her, she was encased in complete darkness. The strong smell of frankincense threatened to overpower her senses, but helped to calm her nerves a little. There was an odd comfort to the smell. It reminded her of the early weekday mornings when her mother had insisted upon dragging her out of bed at an ungodly hour to hear the 6 a.m. service being said before the day had even begun. She let out a huff of breath that she didn't realize she'd been holding, shaking her head to clear the memories that were threatening to come to the surface. Everything was silent in the confessional for a few moments, and she wondered if Father Michael had perhaps not heard her enter. She shuffled awkwardly on the seat to let him know she was there, and the wooden shutter snapped open, causing a sharp noise to echo through the box. She couldn't make out his face clearly, but knew it was Father Michael from the outline of his shadow on the wooden wall behind him. She gulped. She had been so confident with her plan earlier in the day, but now she wasn't so sure. She reminded herself why she was there, and, adopting the role of a young girl asking for absolution, she began. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. In the eyes of others I have been asking blasphemous questions." Catherine rolled her eyes. She tried to make her voice sound regretful. She tried to tread with caution here in case Father Michael completely shut down and refused to speak with her. "And have you, my child? Have you been asking such questions?" Father Michael asked. "No, I don't believe I have. I've only been asking about why someone appears to be playing the chapel organ every night around 3 a.m. Father Michael gasped. His shadow moved on the wall in a jerky fashion. "My child, this really isn't the place to speak of such things," he said, anxiety pitching his voice high. "I strongly urge you to—" "I know that you see what happens here," Catherine interrupted. "The missing orphans. I saw you bless yourself from my window last week when the caretaker disposed of a body during the rainy spell. The remaining children are too afraid to even speak in case they draw attention to themselves. Nobody wants to risk it in case something happens to them. Oh, and let's not forget Sister Nora's absurd fascination with the crucifix she wears. You must have seen it too, hurling and tugging at the chain on her neck like a woman possessed. And that odd darkness in her eyes. You have the answers. I know you do. I am stuck in this orphanage with nowhere to go. The very least you can do is let me know what darkness lies within these walls." Father Michael began muttering and blessing himself with a string of rosary beads. He let out a deep sigh. "Like I said, this isn't the place for this. But I will give you what you seek," he whispered. "After the 9 o'clock service tonight, meet me in my chambers. It should be safe to talk there. In the meantime, my child, for your sake, it would be best to not utter a word of this to anyone. Try to remain as discreet as you can." Catherine didn't respond to Father Michael, but out of habit, she blessed herself before exiting the confessional box. At last, he'd explain everything to her. For now, she had to be patient. "So, what do you think he's going to explain to her? Isn't it a little odd, a young woman, a girl in this case, going to the office of a priest after dark?" Maybe all of the priest scandals have jaded me. Who knows? Let's continue, though, with 8. The remainder of the dull winter's day dragged achingly slow. Every tick of the clock reminded Catherine that she was growing closer to learning what wickedness lay within the walls of the orphanage. She couldn't concentrate on the monotonous drawl of the 9 o'clock sermon. The priest's words had become a dull noise in the back of her head as she examined every possible scenario that Father Michael might explain. If it wasn't for the other girl sitting in her pew, she wouldn't have even known whether it was time for her to sit or stand. A knot had formed in the depths of her stomach. She caught Rose's eye from across the chapel. Rose raised her brows as if to ask if she was all right, but Catherine just smiled back and clasped her hands together, pretending to focus back on her prayers. Her little charade seemed to fool Rose, who turned her head to face the altar again. Catherine made a mental note to calm down. She couldn't risk drawing any unwanted attention to herself. The night had to go according to plan. Not one detail could be out of place. After almost an eternity, the Mass was finally over, and the rest of the orphans made their way to do their nightly chores. They all spilled out of the main double doors, eager to get started on their allotted jobs so they could go to bed. While the rest of them pushed past each other to make their way down the hall, Catherine broke off from the crowd and darted in the opposite direction. Catherine made her way down the damp stone corridor towards Father Michael's chambers. She was concerned that Sister Nora would notice she wasn't doing her chores, but her need for answers gave her the strength to carry on. Cautiously, she looked around to make sure no one had followed her. She raised her fist, hesitating for a moment, and knocked on the heavy wooden door of Father Michael's room. His response was barely audible, but she thought she heard a faint "Enter" in reply. She pushed open the door and tiptoed across the creaky threshold. The room was in total darkness. The only glimmer of light came from a small candle burning in the holder on a desk pushed back against the wall. Father Michael had his back to her, consumed with the task of writing in a worn, leather-bound book. He placed the dip pen back in the pot of black ink, but still didn't turn to face her. Instead, he pulled over a rickety chair and placed it to the side of the desk, glancing over his shoulder, gesturing for her to take a seat. "What are you writing?" she asked, craning her neck to read over his shoulder. Instead of answering her, Father Michael slammed the book shut, bound it with a fraying leather strap, and placed it in a narrow cupboard underneath the desk. He made a show of locking it with a bronze key that he pulled from his pocket. From his clenched jaw, Catherine surmised that he hadn't liked her questioning him about his writing. Before he closed the cupboard door, Catherine had seen at least another 10 books of the same design. Were they journals? Would their contents tell her what she needed to know? She decided not to push the issue further for now. She would have to figure out a way to see the contents of the books at a later stage. A heavy silence hung in the air. She was getting sick of all these awkward moments. Studying Father Michael's face, she assumed he was battling with some deep-rooted internal conflict. His nervousness was palpable, and his mouth kept opening and closing, as though he wanted to speak, but was incapable of uttering a word. She knew what she was asking him to do was a difficult task. He was probably breaking a handful of the orphanage's rules by even meeting with her, let alone telling her its secrets. She rolled her neck in frustration. Time was passing, and she had to be back in line with the other girls by bedtime. Her eyes wandered to a small, faded photograph hanging on the back of the door. She squinted and recognized the two figures in it as Father Michael and Sister Nora. They were both smiling, like two children at the peak of happiness. They both looked much younger. "You knew her, before she was like this, didn't you?" Catherine asked, barely above a whisper. Father Michael's Adam's apple bobbed in his pale throat, giving Catherine all the confirmation she needed. The priest's eyes darted to the photograph, and he let out a deep sigh. "She was a great friend of mine," he said with a brief smile. "A true companion. The type of companion that one can only dream of having in life. But all that changed as her obsession with the crucifix grew." "What is so special about the crucifix?" Catherine blurted out. "It looks different from the other ones I've seen Sister Sarah and Sister Eunice wearing. But surely they're all the same, aren't they?" Father Michael rested both of his palms on the desk before reaching underneath it and pulling out a bottle of brandy. Judging by how little was left in the bottle, Catherine guessed that he must have started drinking it long before she entered the room. Maybe he needed it for courage, she thought. He leaned in closer, the pungent smell of brandy wafting on his breath as he spoke. The crucifix that Sister Nora wears is known to be biblical in its origin. Those worn by the rest of the sisterhood are generic, more symbolic, if you will. They all come from the little sacristy shop next to the cathedral in town. In essence, there is nothing noteworthy about them, but it ensures uniformity. I am sure that you are familiar with the story of how Judas betrayed Jesus, are you not? Catherine gave a meek nod of her head, wondering where Father Michael was going with his story and what it had to do with Sister Nora's ostentatious crucifix. Father Michael stretched his fingers, his bones cracking as he moved. No one fully knows why Judas chose to betray him, other than the fact that he was given 30 pieces of silver from the temple priest for his actions, he said frankly. However, that's not all he received. It isn't noted in the scriptures because the object Judas received was stolen from his own dead body before the authorities could even make a note of it. The missing object, I'm sure you can probably guess, is the very same crucifix which hangs around the neck of Sister Nora. Father Michael stopped for a moment and looked at Catherine over the top of his reading glasses, ensuring that she was fully absorbing what he was saying. It has been said that a wandering shepherd came across the body of Judas while he was on his way to tend to his lowly flock. At first, he was horrified by the sight in front of him, as most would be. The harsh, isolated place in which he was found, and the grotesque expression of pain that was fixed on Judas's face because his soul was destined to descend into hell, was quite a scene to behold. While taking everything in, the shepherd noticed something shining on the ground beneath the body. Dotted around in multiple places lay the 30 pieces of silver, as if Judas had cast them to the ground in a mad fury before deciding to end his own life. Overcome by sheer greed, the poor shepherd quickly gathered the coins before anyone else could see what he was doing. When he stood up, he felt something hit the back of his head. Startled, he quickly turned around, dropping some of the coins in shock, and observed a gold crucifix dangling from Judas's rigid hand. The minute his eyes locked with the gold crucifix, something in him changed. Some say he heard voices, that the crucifix began whispering to him about the power and greatness he could possess. The coins no longer mattered to him, and he completely forgot about the existence of his flock. He snatched the crucifix from Judas's hand and took off across the hills, never to be seen again. They say that he was lost to the devil forever. Catherine held her hands up to stop Father Michael from speaking. I'm not sure I understand you, Father, she said, shaking her head in confusion. None of it made any sense to her. How can someone be lost to the devil by simply taking a crucifix? It's just an object. Father Michael glanced at Catherine as he leaned on the desk before emphasizing his next point. The Gospel says that as soon as Jesus received the piece of bread that Jesus offered him during the Last Supper, Satan entered him. However, that's not necessarily true. He rubbed his temples. For, you see, Satan had already entered Judas the moment he decided to betray those close to him. The very moment his hand touched the crucifix, Satan used it as a gateway to have Judas do his bidding. The crucifix had become tainted by sin, taking control of the dark side that was festering within Judas. He rubbed the spot between his eyebrows vigorously. You see, child, everyone has some level of darkness within them. It's ultimately what makes us human. God and the devil have coexisted within everyone since the beginning of time. What separates us is which power we succumb to. Have you ever wondered why some people are capable of committing monstrous, completely unholy acts, and yet others seem incapable of hurting even the smallest of insects? He went on without giving her a chance to answer. It's because they gave in to the evil residing within them. Over the years, there has been a string of ghastly events with people ending up dead. In each case, the same crucifix has been sighted on the neck of somebody connected with the dead person. Those who wear it have no control over their actions once the crucifix touches their neck. After a while, the people completely change in character. They become darker, their actions sadistic, and their thoughts deeply sinister. The crucifix has been involved in so much death and destruction over the centuries that it's become a sort of gateway for evil. It calls out to the next viable human soul like a siren, providing the unknowing soul with a glimpse of the immense power they can possess. Once it touches human skin, it's as if people are finally able to succumb to the will of the devil and complete whatever atrocious actions he desires. It knows what lies deep within the person's soul, what they've managed to keep at bay for years, and it feeds off it, growing more malevolent after each situation. Catherine was sitting bolt upright as she listened to his tale. This time, she was the one who was lost for words. Whoever wears that crucifix is destined to complete grave atrocities, and every time another death occurs, the evil grows stronger. That's why so many bad things have happened here, he finally admitted. How did the crucifix even end up in this orphanage if it dates back to biblical times? Catherine asked. Like many antiquities, so to speak, it has been shipped around the world over time and passed down through generations. It just so happens that the previous Reverend Mother, Sister Bernadette, inherited the crucifix from her own sister following her death. What happened to Sister Bernadette? Catherine asked with a shaky breath, already dreading the answer. Father Michael hesitated. He had anticipated that Catherine would ask this very question, but it still didn't prepare him for the mental turmoil of reliving what had happened to the previous Reverend Mother. It was as if the question itself had brought him back to that time, and he was witnessing the horror of it all over again. Towards the end of Sister Bernadette's reign in the orphanage, I was concerned for her safety. Sister Nora's fascination with Bernadette's crucifix was beginning to surpass insurmountable levels. It was all she could speak of. It was consuming her. There were times when I watched her secretly, and it was as if she was in a hypnotic trance. She would stare at Sister Bernadette and stroke her own neck, as if imagining the crucifix resting there. At that point, it wasn't even in her possession. It wasn't too long before there were a series of tragedies in the orphanage. Bernadette kept showing up with injuries that she passed off as being caused by accidents. Falling down the stairs and things like that. She seemed quite skittish of everyone, too, but there was no concrete explanation as to what had caused the sudden change in her character. She didn't want to speak of it, and so I never pushed her. I thought she wasn't comfortable disclosing any information to me. The orphans were terrified too, but when I questioned them, they remained silent. I think they knew who was responsible for the accidents. He stopped to gulp more brandy before he continued. Sister Nora was becoming less like the friend I had grown fond of. There was a shocking darkness about her. Even her eyes seemed to change. They used to hold such warmth and optimism, but any light that had once been present was long gone. At the time, I couldn't explain it, But knowing what I do now, I believe that crucifix was already speaking to her immoral side, controlling her and pulling her towards it. The darkness was impossible to break through, despite my sincerest efforts. After a while, I realized, for the sake of my own life, I needed to keep a safe distance from her. I was afraid she would do the same things to me that she had done to those poor students. I know what you're thinking. It was weak of me to distance myself, but you've seen what she can do. You've experienced the pain she can cause, and no one wants to be on the receiving end of that. Some of the orphans had begun to whisper about strange noises coming from the chapel late at night. Some said they could even feel vibrations from the floorboards. There was one girl whose room was directly above the chapel. I don't think she had been here very long, but she claimed that someone was playing the organ in the wee hours. Father Michael fidgeted in his seat. Of course, at the time, there was no proof, and we thought the children were just making up stories as a coping mechanism, if you like. The stories were just so odd. I would have never believed them myself, were it not for one grim night. The night where I saw firsthand the true, unmitigated power that the crucifix is capable of. Father Michael gazed off into the distance, his brow furrowed as he became haunted by the memories that had been stirred up. He thought he had buried them deep within himself. I was working late in my chambers one night, and at about 3 in the morning, I felt the vibrations myself. It was so strong, it seemed to exude from the floorboards and up the walls. It continued for a few moments, and then stopped. At first I thought it must have been coming from the old pipes in the building. Old pipes are notorious for rattling when they settle. But then it happened again. It was bizarre. I wondered if it was one of the new girls playing a trick, so I rushed to the chapel to try to catch the culprit in the act. Instead, what I found shook me to the very core. It was truly horrific. I'll never be able to forget it. It made me question my faith. He rubbed his eyes as though trying to erase the image. Sister Nora was standing over the lifeless body of Sister Bernadette, who was lying crumpled in a heap on the altar steps. I could tell she was gone the moment I looked at her. There was so much blood. So much. The glow from the candelabras was creating a dull light around them. I thought perhaps she hadn't noticed me standing in the darkness, because she didn't turn around to face me. But thinking back now, her whole demeanor showed she was too strongly connected to the crucifix at that point to even care about being caught. He raised his index finger just as Catherine opened her mouth to interrupt him. Let me finish. Nora had fortified her connection to the devil by committing the most heinous sin imaginable. She wanted the crucifix so badly that she was willing to kill for it. She threw away her vows and everything holy that she believed in. He paused and shifted in his seat. She was clutching a blood-splattered candlestick so tightly, her knuckles were white. I was wondering what I should do when she suddenly hit Sister Bernadette across the side of her head, even though she was already dead. The sound of it paralyzed me. He shook his head and a tear escaped the corner of one eye. The sheer force she was exerting forced droplets of sweat from her forehead to fall onto Sister Bernadette's face, making it look like she was crying. It was the most horrific thing I've ever had to bear witness to. He swallowed the lump that was beginning to form in his throat. When she stopped, She leaned down right into Sister Bernadette's face. By now, I could clearly see her face, and she was smiling. She snatched the crucifix from Sister Bernadette's neck and tossed the candlestick to the side, causing a clattering noise to echo throughout the empty chapel. I watched her stand up and place the crucifix around her own neck. The few candles that had remained alight throughout the horrific act suddenly died. But there was no gust of air in the chapel that could explain it. It was clear to me that God's presence was no longer in the chapel. Father Michael made eye contact with Catherine. Sister Nora looked directly at me then and said without any emotion, "I require some assistance, Father Michael. It seems that Sister Bernadette has had a most unfortunate accident." Ugh. There you go. Creepy. What do you guys think? Creepy? Yes. Stupid crucifix taken over the mind and body of a devout Catholic nun. The crucifix worn by Judas as he died for his sins. And as there are no comments, I'm going to take a quick drink and we will continue. Normally I go only about an hour and a half, but I'm on a cruise next week. And because I'm on a cruise, I'm hoping that there might be a chance of me getting through this book before then. But I don't know. We'll see. We'll see how it all goes, right? So, we continue with 9. Catherine jumped up, almost knocking her chair over in the process, and had to steady herself by placing her arm on the nearby wall. "You helped her cover it up?" she said, her voice rising in anger. "You've known for years what she is capable of, what the crucifix has made her do, and you've helped her every step along the way. How can you, as a man of God, answer to that? You're meant to protect us. Have you no shame?" "I accepted my faith long ago." Father Michael's speech was slurred. He drained the last drop of brandy that was left in the bottle. "I know that when the judgment day finally comes, I will be made to answer for my sins. I have no answer that you will ever find acceptable for what I have done. I think, looking back on it now, I just wanted to protect a friend, but as the years went by, I must admit, I was too afraid of the repercussions if I didn't help her, and too ashamed to admit it." Catherine shook her head in disgust. "How many deaths have you let slide because of your fear?" she hissed. Father Michael slumped down in his chair and put his head in his hands and sobbed. Catherine didn't have any words of comfort to offer him. She was reeling from what she had heard, made worse by the fact that the man she had thought she could trust was Sister Nora's right-hand man in all the atrocities she had committed. Catherine didn't have the patience for his pitiful guilt. It was too late for that. If he had any remorse for his actions, he would have tried to do better, to help the girls in the orphanage. "I'm so sorry," Father Michael whispered through his sobbing. "She has eyes on you all the time, and there is nothing I can do to protect you." Catherine's blood ran cold at his admission. She now had confirmation that Sister Nora was indeed watching her from the shadows. She wasn't sure how to process that. It had been easier to pretend she could somehow exempt herself from the horrors of the place, that the violence she was subjected to was simply a punishment for not following orders. Father Michael kept repeating how sorry he was, but Catherine had nothing to say to him in return. Instead, aware how much time had passed, she stormed out of the chapel and made it back in time to join the other girls on their way to the dorms. When Sister Nora had finished her rounds that night, Catherine went straight to bed. Her heart was still racing at the recent revelations. Never in her wildest dreams had she imagined this would be her reality. She didn't believe in the existence of the devil. She always thought it was made up to get children to behave. But now she knew evil truly existed, and it was operating within the convent's walls. She thought about the notebooks that the priest had tried to conceal from her. She guessed they would reveal a lot more to her than he had. She still had so many unanswered questions. Why was Sister Nora singling her out to be watched? It wouldn't be easy to find out, or get a hold of the key to retrieve Father Michael's journals. She would have to devise a plan. Catherine spent the next few days mulling over the different options for obtaining the key from Father Michael without him knowing. Images of the exact moment she gained access to the cupboard ran in a loop through her head. She could see the outcome, the dual victory of pulling off the key heist and gaining all the answers to her questions. This vision made the blood pump through her veins. She needed to know exactly what Sister Nora had planned for her. Catherine refused to believe it was too late for her to escape the nun's attention, as Father Michael did. She wasn't like the other girls. She couldn't live each day in anticipation of pain, hoping she might succumb to her injuries one day and escape this hellhole by dying. Her mother had always told her that she was a deceptive, resourceful child, so she figured now would be the perfect time to live up that reputation. It was time to use those traits to her advantage, to fight for her life. The following week, when Sister Eunice was assigning all the orphans their chores for the week, she volunteered to clean the chapel. "I'll do it, sister," she sang while raising her hand with a false level of enthusiasm. All the girls hated this task and considered it akin to punishment. With every inch of the place right down to the pews and chalices needing to be meticulously polished and shined with beeswax, it was a time-consuming task. It wasn't unheard of for some of the girls' hand joints to lock from the repetitive task. It was usually reserved for those who had angered Sister Nora throughout the previous week, but not enough to warrant her usual abuse. She used it to torment them, ordering Sister Eunice to assign the role to whatever girl she had on her list. "Why would you want to do that, Catherine?" Sister Eunice asked without even looking up. She was a plump woman around 30 years old, with a round, bulging face and beady eyes. She was naturally suspicious about everything. Catherine had heard that she suffered from gout and couldn't stand for longer than a few minutes at a time. Catherine thought she was utterly useless, but she intended using the nun's weakness for her own benefit. "The sooner you have someone to clean the chapel, the sooner you can cross it off your list and retire to your chambers. That is what you want, isn't it?" "You, child," the nun said with a sneer, "would do best to keep your mouth shut. However, you can clean the chapel. I expect every surface to shine by the time you're finished. Off you go, everyone!" she screamed as she hobbled towards her dormitory. Catherine cared little for the well-being of Sister Eunice's legs. She only wanted access to the chapel for one reason. Part of cleaning the chapel included cleaning the office, which is where Father Michael would leave his overgarments before beginning his sermon. It was a perfect chore for her to carry out her plan. Since she was excused from attending Mass while she cleaned, she would have the perfect opportunity to slip the key out of his overcoat and return it before he even had a chance to notice that it was missing. Slipping items from people's pockets was one of her specialties, but she had never returned anything that she had taken before, so this part would be entirely new to her. How hard can it be, she thought. After breakfast, she finished on Tuesday morning. She went over to Father Michael's office to execute the first step in her plan. She greeted him with a brief, "Good morning, Father," as she entered. careful not to appear too excited in case he should become suspicious. She made her way over to the basin of holy water and blessed herself. She would need every bit of help from God today. Thankfully, Father Michael paid little attention to her as he was busy poring over the Bible in preparation for his sermon. Catherine started to dust the paintings at the far side of the room. She had to play her part in carrying out her chores, at least for a few minutes until Father Michael had left the room. She kept a discreet eye on him as she worked. A few minutes later, he glanced over the top of his reading glasses at the antique clock on the wall and snapped the Bible closed, then disappeared inside the small room at the back of the office that he used for changing into his robes. He emerged dressed in his priestly attire. "Nearly lost track of time," he said as he shuffled past. He gave her a quick nod, brushed off an invisible wrinkle on his robe, and strode towards the chapel. If it had been any other day, and if she didn't know his true nature, Catherine would have found his awkwardness quite humorous. She knew he was avoiding her, most likely afraid that she might tell someone his secret. Her opinion of him had changed drastically since his revelation. He disgusted her. Even looking at him made her curl her lip. But her new opinion of him made the execution of her plan so much easier. She didn't feel bad for stealing from a priest. In fact, she considered it a form of karmic retribution for the atrocities that he had helped cover up. As soon as she heard the opening hymns begin to play, Catherine wasted no time. She dropped the duster on the floor and ran into the room where he had dressed only a few minutes prior. She thrust her hand into the right-hand pocket of his coarse coat and felt the key right away. She pulled it from the garment and looked down at the key in her palm. She'd done it. Now all her nerves were gone, and she chuckled. That was easy, she thought, but then realized she couldn't get ahead of herself. The hard part was yet to come. She only had approximately 40 minutes to pull this off, and she couldn't risk being caught. She strode over to the office door and eased it open, being careful not to allow the door to bang behind her. She didn't want Father Michael to hear it in the middle of his sermon. She tiptoed down the steep steps outside, looking around her as she did to make sure that no one was around. Her gaze fell on a large rock that was part of the border of a flower bed. She wedged the muddy rock at the corner of the doorframe to stop it from slamming and sprinted over to the main building towards Father Michael's own private chambers. The sound of the congregation chanting their prayers was ringing in her ears as she ran towards her destination. "As we forgive those who trespass against us, and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil." We will just continue to roll along, everyone. 11. The hallway was silent as Catherine, now out of breath, reached the door to Father Michael's chambers. The door was old and heavy. She had to use her shoulder to push it open a fraction, then squeezed her way in. As soon as she was safe inside, she shut the door and rested her back against it. She needed a moment to prepare herself for what she was about to find. She moved over to the cabinet beneath the desk and forced her shaking hand to remain still enough to insert the key. Catherine smiled when she heard the faint click of the lock opening. Leaving the key in the cabinet door, she leaned back on her haunches and pulled both doors open. A gust of dust hit her in the face, and she stifled the resulting cough with her hand. There had to be at least 10 identical notebooks inside. She wondered where to start, but figured the dustiest would be the oldest, and as such, would provide the information she needed. She hauled the first book from the cabinet and placed it on Father Michael's chair, which she used as a makeshift table. Using the sleeve of her dress to wipe away the dust, she opened it to the first page. The text was so faded and yellow with age it was difficult to read. Catherine lit the small candle sitting on Father Michael's desk and brought it right up next to the book, which helped a little, but she could only make out a few distinct words, and what she could decipher shocked her. Bludgeoned, tortured, severed tongue. Pages and pages of descriptions of brutal acts against the orphanage's occupants, all documented with precision as if he had simply been making one of his daily mundane reports. Her blood ran cold, and her breathing became shallow. She knew that Father Michael had been covering for Sister Nora, but she hadn't considered the extent of the nun's actions. She had been abusing both the orphans and the staff alike for as long as she had been working in the orphanage. Such inexplicable cruelty from one woman, due to the maleficent powers attached to the ancient crucifix that owned her. And with the help of one man who hid the truth as she continued her sadistic practices. She was so consumed by her own terrified thoughts that she hadn't even noticed that her short breathing had extinguished the candle she was holding. With shaking and sweating hands, she managed to relight the candle and place the book to one side, starting a little pile next to her. She apprehensively grabbed the next book and braced herself with half-squinted eyes for what was going to be contained within its stiff spine. Feeling sick with apprehension at what else she would discover, she grabbed another book. The worn spine opened automatically to the middle page. The text was handwritten in black ink and was set out like a type of ledger. There were pages full of names and ages of girls with a corresponding year and date underlined next to each one. At first she couldn't make sense of it, but then she found a name with the current year and it suddenly dawned on her. Siobhan Madigan, September 2nd, 1865. The bile rose in her throat, and she felt like she was going to throw up. Catherine had first come to the orphanage on the afternoon of September 2nd, and that was when she had witnessed the caretaker moving a dead body in a wheelbarrow. She remembered hearing some of the girls whispering that night, saying something bad must have happened to a girl called Siobhan, as she hadn't come back to the dormitory since Sister Nora had called her into her office. Catherine tried to shake off a feeling of dread as she scrolled down through the rest of the names on the page. Her finger stopped below another familiar name, Aoife Crowley. Her stomach lurched, and her hand flew to her mouth. She rushed to the nearby wastebasket and gagged. The name of Aoife Crowley stuck out to her like a shining beacon for several reasons. Not only was this the name attached to the very recent headstone in the graveyard where she had encountered Grace and Lauren a few weeks earlier, but there was a photograph of Aoife hanging in the main hallway. A fake smile that didn't reach her eyes plastered upon her ghostly pale face. Catherine's body felt weak. Her legs threatened to crumple beneath her. The ledger of names was the names of all of Sister Nora's victims throughout the years. Father Michael had kept a record of every single one. She didn't know whether it was because of guilt or the fact that he may have managed to disassociate from the events that made him even acknowledge the vicious atrocities. But, in a way, she was grateful because she now had a thorough understanding of the lengths that Sister Nora could go to. She let out a shaky sigh and caught a glimpse of the little clock on the desk. She had been here for nearly 30 minutes. Mass would be ending soon, and she needed to put everything back in its place before Father Michael noticed anything had been moved. She blew out the candle, thrust the notebooks back inside the musty cabinet, and turned the key in the lock. With the key still clenched in her hand, she sprinted back to the chapel, sending gravel flying around her in the process. She kicked the large stone which had been holding the office door open away from the building and jumped over the threshold. The door slammed shut behind her, and she cursed herself for making so much noise. If Father Michael asked, she would say she opened the door to allow some fresh air in for him. She had just enough time to replace the key in his coat pocket and grab a nearby rag before he walked into the office. She turned to greet him. "Just finishing up, Father Michael. I'll be out of your way in a moment," she said in a pleasant tone of voice. Father Michael barely acknowledged her before heading past her into the room to change. He really is a fool, Catherine thought. The place is still filthy, and he hasn't even noticed. Catherine threw away the dusty rag she had been holding and sauntered out at the chapel door with a little pep in her step that terrified her. Given all that she knew now, it seemed wrong that she should be so enthusiastic, but she was conflicted by the whole situation. She felt a sense of euphoria at having carried out her master plan with such success, but she was scared stiff about being stuck in an orphanage under the control of a possessed nun who seemed to have a keen interest in her, and there was no one she could trust or turn to for help within these walls. What was she to do now? It does beg the question of me, though. Why doesn't she just run away? She had 40 minutes while they were in Mass. Run, Catherine, run! I don't know. I guess maybe that wasn't a thing in those times. What I do know for sure is 12. Oh, 12. It was now Sunday afternoon, and the last few days had passed by in a hazy blur for Catherine as she continued with her daily methodical routine. She was eager to keep a safe distance between herself and Father Michael, and so she threw herself fully into tackling the never-ending list of chores that Sister Nora gave her. If she kept her head down, she wouldn't draw any attention to herself. Catherine was struggling to come to terms with what was happening around her. She could understand why she picked orphans as her victims of choice. In a country where overcrowding and a lack of state funding was common, and with no relatives to apply pressure, she imagined the state would turn a blind eye to the disappearance or death of some children in a remote orphanage. Catherine was pruning a tree in the front garden. Stopping to stretch her aching back for a moment, she heard rapid footsteps crunching on the gravel path nearby. She glanced up from her work and nearly jumped out of her skin. Sister Nora was standing right in front of her, her intimidating figure blocking out the sun. The nun's usually emotionless face was flushed and her breathing labored. Her usually pristine heels were caked in thick mud and sludge. Catherine shivered. "My office, Catherine! Now!" she barked at her through gritted teeth. Catherine's stomach sank. She knew Sister Nora must have found out about her secret meeting with Father Michael. Why else would she be so furious? She trudged across the gravel and through the cold hallway towards Sister Nora's office. She was tempted to run away, but knew she would only make the situation worse. The last time she had been in Sister Nora's office, she left unable to walk, with scarred legs, and she hadn't even done anything to warrant the abuse. What punishment would she have to endure this time when Sister Nora had a viable reason to discipline her? Sister Nora brushed past her into the office and beckoned with a deafening click of her fingers for Catherine to take a seat in the middle of the room, while she looked for something in the nearby press. A small wheeled table covered with a dingy towel set next to her chair. That hadn't been in the room last time she was there. She gripped the edge of the chair tightly, staring at the table. Whatever was underneath that towel was meant for her. The torture that had been documented in the notebooks flashed through her mind. She couldn't stop her knees from shaking. Sister Nora closed the press with a heavy thud and returned to stand next to Catherine. She pulled on a pair of black rubber gloves, snapping them at the wrist. She had not even glanced in the direction of the shaking orphan or uttered a word, but her breathing had quickened, and her face was bright red with fury. She wheeled the table over so that it was right in front of her and whipped off the towel, revealing the sordid contents that lay beneath. Catherine started to sob, her whole body shaking from panic. On the table lay a variety of tools, some of which she had never seen before, but she did recognize a set of rusted forceps. She rose from her chair to try to reason with Sister Nora, but all she received was a harsh slap across her cheek that silenced her and left a bright red handprint on her face. "Was I not clear the last time I spoke with you, when I told you that you needed to learn your place? Did the pain in your legs not act as a reminder for your tiny brain of what would happen if you didn't comply?" Sister Nora asked, pushing Catherine back onto the chair. Catherine began to stutter a weak explanation, but the words that came rushing from her mouth were almost incoherent.
Nothing happens within these walls without my knowledge,
Sister Nora said, walking around Catherine.
So I know about your little secret meeting with Father Michael.
Sister Nora had started to run her fingers across the old tools on the table while she was speaking, touching each one as if they were precious items. Catherine imagined she was savoring how the cold metal felt against her skin. Her hand eventually came to rest on one of the forceps. She snatched them up and pressed them from one hand to the other like she was playing with them.
Do you not like how I run things here? Does it scare you?
She scoffed.
You're not the first one who has attempted to stand in my way here, to try to work out what I'm doing or why.
Sister Nora suddenly stopped talking and sighed, as if the whole situation was exhausting for her. She halted in front of Catherine and closed her eyes. She smiled. When she opened her eyes again, they were black and empty. She raised her hands and grasped the crucifix, her knuckles growing white from the pressure, and she let out another deep sigh.
I do these things because I can. I told you before, little Catherine, that I am the only God you need to know within these walls, and I am free to do whatever I want. No one can prove what I'm doing here,
She said in a blunt manner.
There is really no outside this pitiful orphanage who cares enough to check on the words of the state. You are all at my disposal. In fact, a few less mouths to feed here and there is probably a blessing for the country. I'm doing the country a justice. But I don't need to explain to you, of all people, what I get out of it,
Sister Nora said and chuckled. Catherine looked up at her in fear and confusion.
You won't admit it,
The nun went on,
but I know you truly understand the feeling of getting away with certain acts. That sheer rush of being able to control the people around you, to have them obey your every command, and dispose of them once they become useless.
Sister Nora leaned down and put both her arms on the chair, trapping Catherine. She moved in close to Catherine's ear and whispered,
You, too, have the devil inside you.
Catherine felt like her heart was about to leap from her chest. She had heard that statement only once before in her life. She didn't know if it was her fear that was making her hear things, but Sister Nora's voice had sounded exactly like her mother's. Catherine glanced up at the face hovering above her, her heart beating in her chest. She was afraid of what she might see. She blinked twice to clear her vision, for it was her mother's face staring right back at her.
Creepy ass book.
But, ladies and gentlemen, we continue. Let's see, where are we at? Yeah, we're not even halfway through. I don't know that we're going to make it through this in 2 sessions, but we're going to go a little bit farther tonight. How's that? Let's see if we can make it up through 15. Maybe. Just maybe. We'll find out what happens when we go into 13. Catherine's mother had always been critical of her daughter. She couldn't accept that Catherine wasn't the traditional Catholic farm girl like the other girls in the village. She wasn't quiet and submissive like them, nor eager to please her parents. She was resourceful and cunning, wise beyond her years and able to get away with misdeeds. Money was always tight in their household. a fact her parents had pointed out to her ever since she was a young child, but that never stopped her from getting what she wanted. It had started with pocketing some of Mrs. Wilson's soda bread from the corner market stall whenever she passed after the service on Sundays. Her nimble actions meant she was long gone before Mrs. Wilson had even noticed any of her stock was missing. The glee Catherine felt when she took a bite into that thick crust was indescribable. Why should she ever go without, when everything around her was for the taking? She could have anything she wanted. All she had to do was watch for opportunities as they presented themselves. Of course, Catherine always tried to play the part of the virtuous daughter, but her mother never fell for her deception. The collection of crumbs she often found in Catherine's coat pocket probably didn't help, but exposing Catherine's lies was only part of their difficult relationship. It was as if she could see through Catherine's mask of duplicity to what was really hidden in the depths of Catherine's soul. As the extent of Catherine's lies grew over the years, so did her mother's fear of her. No punishment or restriction, no teaching of the difference between right and wrong, either morally or legally, made any difference. Looking back, Catherine could almost pinpoint the moment that her mother realized she would never be able to control her. The event that caused Catherine's mother to understand her daughter's true nature was the mysterious disappearance of the village doctor's 8-year-old daughter, Michelle. As the only child of the esteemed doctor, she was spoiled by the villagers, so no one thought it odd that Catherine would befriend her even though she was a few years older. Catherine thought she was the only one who saw Michelle for what she truly was, a spoiled, entitled crybaby, always carrying around a tattered little doll that her mother had knitted for her when she was a baby. She'd been born to a life of ease. Her blonde, curly locks and bulbous face that was always red from crying made Catherine particularly vexed. What reason could she have for crying all the time? She didn't know the hardships of the real world. Not yet. Catherine was the last person to ever see Michelle alive. When the worried doctor knocked on the door of their home late that night, eager to locate his child, Catherine rattled off well-rehearsed tale of how they'd been playing by the creek behind the church for most of the day. When it was time for Catherine to go home, Michelle had refused to leave, despite Catherine's desperate pleas that she would get into trouble if she wasn't home before dark. But she didn't tell him what really happened to the half-witted Michelle. They never did find her body, only the tattered little doll she carried around. The execution of her plan had been almost perfect. She hadn't anticipated her mother would arrive home early that evening. If she had only arrived 10 minutes later, she would never have caught her hiding her blood-stained clothes by a pile of rocks near the well. Thankfully, her mother believed that blood was thicker than water, so she never told the police or the doctor what she saw. After that, Catherine sensed her mother deliberately avoided her and began placing holy medals in every room of the house as a form of protection. But she still kept a watchful eye on her daughter. Then, in the spring, an incident occurred with a local village boy named Seamus Murphy. Seamus was always fawning over Catherine, following her around and looking for her approval like a lost puppy. He tagged along with her and her friends as if he had belonged with them. He seemed to think he was entitled to join them because the rest of the village decided he and Catherine were a perfect match, and that there was an understanding between the two families. Her family had been friends with his family for years, and his family had significant plots of land. Their union would protect the land for years to come, while also ensuring comfort for her own family for generations. Seamus's parents saw Catherine as a sort of carer for their dim-witted son, believing she would set him right and give him enough children to take care of the farms. Catherine thought Seamus was the definition of slow, and everything he did irritated her. He was rude and constantly spoke at her while refusing to listen to anything she had to say. He had lank, greasy hair and always smelt like the farm he worked on, a mixture of cow manure and mud. He went around wearing trousers that were always a bit too short for his legs, but he never seemed to notice despite the cool air freezing his exposed skin. And even though she'd never shown any interest in him, he would always call her his missus. How could she even consider him a match for her? But there would never be a marriage if Seamus was no longer alive. The only good thing about his devotion was that he blindly did everything she wanted, which she used to her advantage. She recalled one time when a neighbor's cat had a litter of kittens. They were lovely little things, all black and white and pottering around as they learned to walk. Catherine, by her own admission, was a little jealous. She had always wanted a cat of her own, but her father had never allowed it. The old woman who owned the mother cat now had a whole litter for herself. It wasn't fair. Why should she have to go without? The kitten's arrival provided her with the basis of an ingenious plan, a plan that would not only rid her of Seamus, but one that would also give the old woman what she deserved, because she had the one thing Catherine wanted. One evening, Catherine said to Seamus, "If we're ever to be together, Seamus, I need to know that you'll do anything for me, that you'll provide for me. I really need those kittens. If you can't get them for me, then I don't think I'll ever be able to marry you." "Will you really be my wife if I get you those kittens? Do you promise?" Seamus asked, the hopeful tone of his voice making Catherine nauseous. "You can't break a promise, you know," he said, pointing his finger at her. "So if you promise me, you can't back out." You really are an idiot, she thought. His eyes had lit up when she promised him. She even faked being excited about their future together. He hung on her every word. It was the only time she recalled him ever truly listening to her. It was all too easy to plant the devious seed in his head. She told him to wait until everyone had gone to bed and that he couldn't tell a soul about their plan. People wouldn't understand. He promised he would return that night with the kittens so they could be together. Catherine had to stop herself from rolling her eyes in front of him. He was so pathetic. Catherine slipped out that night to witness her plan in action. She knew Seamus would get caught quickly because he was too clumsy to remain undetected for long. What Catherine hadn't told Seamus was that the old woman's husband had failing eyesight and always slept with a shotgun by his bedside in case he was burgled. She'd learned this information when she'd eavesdropped on her parents, who were good friends of their neighbors. Perched on a nearby fence with her cloak wrapped tightly around her, Catherine swung her legs back and forth as she waited for the sound to go off. She could have only been there for 15 minutes when she heard frantic shouting followed by two echoing booms. She clasped her hands together, closed her eyes, and threw her head back to the sky, relishing in her triumph. Her eyes shot open when the third gunshot went off. She hadn't been expecting a third shot. Seamus must have really scared them when he broke into their house. Catherine chuckled at the thought. It wasn't long before the villagers came running out of their homes to see what the deafening noise had been. She heard the old woman screaming, so Catherine took that as her cue to head back home. She whistled as she skipped through an overgrown field. Her plan had worked. She'd gotten rid of Seamus and tainted the neighbor's cottage with the image of his dead body. She ran into the kitchen laughing and congratulating herself to find her mother sitting at the table, under the dim glow of a small candle. Her shoulders were slumped and her eyes were wide and glassy. She didn't have to ask her what had happened. The distant screaming and the jovial look on Catherine's face gave everything away. Her mother only spoke one sentence to her before she leaped to her feet and backed out of the room. She didn't ask for any explanation, but said in a low voice, "You, my girl, have the devil within you." It was a statement that had stayed with Catherine over the years. Shortly after, the threats of being sent to the Convent of Mercy began. Catherine didn't care. She had managed to get what she wanted, to be rid of Seamus. She'd never made it a secret that she didn't want to marry Seamus, but nobody listened to her or told him to back off. What she wanted didn't matter to them. Seamus was an idiot, and she didn't see anything wrong with ridding herself of an imbecile who wouldn't leave her alone. She didn't shed a tear at Seamus's funeral, nor did she defend him when people called him a vandal for breaking into the house. She was proud of herself for having sorted out her problem on her own, but unfortunately, she never did get that kitten. And that was the real tragedy in her eyes. Back in the present, Catherine shut her eyes and shook her head, desperate to get away from the memories of her haunting old life. Her mother was long dead, so she knew that her mind must have been playing tricks on her. She couldn't be here looking at her. When she reopened them, Sister Nora's black eyes stared right back, piercing through her.
You talk too much, Catherine. You are too loose with your words, and your inability to fall in line is growing problematic for me. I would have thought our last discussion would have penetrated that thick skull of yours with the importance of staying out of my business,
she said, jabbing her finger at Catherine's temple.
But perhaps we need to try a harsher approach to make the message sink in. Open your mouth.
Catherine vehemently shook her head. Every instinct in her body was telling her to keep her mouth clamped shut.
Open your mouth, or I will open it for you,
Sister Nora barked. She dropped her arms from the chair, and Catherine saw her opportunity. She leaped up and tried to run to the door, but Sister Nora managed to intercept her and drag her back to the chair with an inhuman strength. Then she lunged at Catherine, pulling her hair back and ripping out some chunks in the process. She forced her head back so that it was facing upwards and used the forceps to make her mouth remain open. If Catherine tried to close her mouth, she would only taste rusted metal and probably destroy her teeth. Sister Nora remained still for a few moments, then began tapping the forceps across each tooth while staring menacingly at her.
Which tooth should I go for first?
She said, her eyes gleaming as she taunted the young girl. Catherine's eyes were wide with fear, and she could barely see Sister Nora through her tears. Her pupils kept darting back and forth between Sister Nora's face and the forceps, trying to gauge when she would pounce, hoping to brace for the impact. She could see how the nun was enjoying the extent of the power she had over her, knowing there was nothing Catherine could do to stop what was coming.
You are stuck here, Catherine,
she said, breathing harshly into her face.
And I will not tolerate anyone meddling in my affairs. You think you are all holier than thou, going behind my back to Father Michael, and to find out what exactly. Answers to questions which you already knew. You knew what happened to those girls. Come on now, Catherine. Aren't you meant to be smart? Did you really believe that the body you saw on your first day was due to natural causes?
Sister Nora scoffed and rolled her eyes.
What exactly were you planning to do once you'd got those answers? Did you think you could find solace in Father Michael? That he was going to save you? That little idiot will be no help to you. He does as I say, just like everyone else within these walls. Blood will continue to be shed within this place for as long as I wish. It is my kingdom to do with as I please, and all of you are disposable beings, like trash.
Unexpectedly, Sister Nora loosened her tight grip on Catherine's hair. She retreated slowly, like a snake slithering back into its hole, and stood in front of the gasping orphan, twisting the forceps around in her hand. Catherine couldn't believe it. Had Sister Nora decided to let her go after all? Was this all just to teach her a lesson? She tried to pull herself together as best she could. She straightened herself up and swiped her tears away. Then she remembered her previous vow to never show fear in Sister Nora's presence. She glared at her through narrowed eyes and sniffed, then used the back of her hand to wipe her nose. She was angry with herself for having succumbed to her fear. In an instant, she had undone her promise to herself. She would have kicked herself if she could. As if sensing Catherine's anger and frustration, Sister Nora smirked. Her free hand reached up to brush against the crucifix, and she shook her head, her face contorted in a twisted grin as a maniacal chuckle emerged. She lunged towards Catherine, who was flung backwards off her chair. Her back slammed into the wooden floor, and the chair clattered to the side. Winded, Catherine didn't have time to register what was happening as Sister Nora straddled her and perched on her chest. Catherine didn't have enough strength left to push the nun off her body. Her weak arms could only hit at the nun's legs, a futile attempt as Sister Nora didn't even register the impact. And the nun's weight made it difficult for her to breathe, so she couldn't even let out a desperate cry for help. Suddenly, she could breathe momentarily as Sister Nora leaned forward, thrust the forceps into Catherine's mouth, and pulled out one of her back molars, slicing through her tongue in the process. Blood gushed forth, and the pain made her head spin. Sister Nora sat back on her chest, restricting her breath once more. She held up the stolen molar to the light and smiled. Catherine could make out part of her gum still attached to the end of the tooth. She began to cough, the thick red blood spluttering from her mouth, but Sister Nora just leaned over her and smiled. The last thing Catherine saw before she passed out was the glint of the crucifix as it fell from Sister Nora's neck and dangled over her face. Well, we have a pair of twisted folk, huh? All right, guys, let's see if we can get through 2 more chapters before we end it for the night. Long read tonight, long read. But the book has been really good so far. I am enjoying it. Hope you guys are too. Let us continue with 14. The next morning, Catherine awoke sweating in her bed. She didn't know how she had managed to get back to her room, but she guessed that Sister Nora must have called upon Father Michael to take her back to her room once she had finished with her. It took Catherine a few moments to take in her surroundings, and the true horror of the events of the evening prior came flooding back to her. Overcome by the shock of it, her tears started to spill. She gingerly made her way from her bed to the murky mirror hanging on the adjacent wall. She had to stretch up on her tiptoes to see her reflection in the glass, but once her face came into view, She barely recognized the reflection staring back at her. Her hair was knotted and raggedy, and her scalp was red raw from the clumps of hair that Sister Nora had ripped from her. Her complexion was that of a ghost, pale and gaunt, and she looked almost ill. She inched her hand up to touch the side of her face, but recoiled only a few seconds later due to the intense pain she felt in her mouth when her hand touched her cheek. She leaned in closer to the mirror and forced herself to open her mouth to get a better look at the damage that had been done. The side of her tongue was swollen, and the cut was deep from the forceps. There was a gaping dark hole at the back of her gum, which was still bleeding from where her tooth once was. She was in disbelief, as if trapped in a nightmare that wouldn't end. Despite the pain, she moved her tongue tentatively across the rest of her mouth to make sure Sister Nora hadn't destroyed anything else when she'd passed out. She sank down to the floor in despair and rested her head upon her knees. The floors were cold against her skin, but she would rather focus on that than the searing pain she could feel in her face. She knew from everything she had learnt that some orphans who had come up against the malicious nun weren't as lucky as she, to make it out of her office alive. Why had Sister Nora chosen to toy with her rather than ending her life? If she was such a threat to her grand plan, why keep her around? It was difficult to feel relieved about being alive when she was stuck in the orphanage with this mad woman until she became 18. That is, if I survive to become 18, she thought. She felt like an animal trapped inside a cage with its predator. It may have been easier for her if Sister Nora had just ended everything there, but it was evident why she had chosen to torture her instead. Sister Nora didn't want to make things easier for Catherine. She wanted to make her every minute filled with terror and pain. It was all a game of power to her. Catherine closed her eyes and tried to take a deep breath, but as soon as her eyelids shut, all she could see was the crucifix hanging over her face. She forced herself to open her eyes and shook her head in a frenzy from side to side, trying to get rid of that haunting imagery from her mind. If this whole situation taught her anything, it was that Sister Nora wasn't fully human. Up until she came to the orphanage, she didn't even know of this woman, and she was certain that her family hadn't either. However, Sister Nora knew about a conversation that she had had privately with her mother, word for word, as if she had been there right next to them when it happened. She had even managed to mimic her mother's voice, a sound she herself hadn't heard in months. No human could know these things, or be able to mimic someone's voice so profoundly. It was clear that Sister Nora was being controlled by an inhuman entity that was giving her unexplainable power. Father Michael had said it was the devil, but he also said that evil lies within everyone. So maybe this was who Sister Nora really was. Perhaps she was the evil entity, and the crucifix was simply letting her true nature be shown. Catherine was both intrigued and terrified by the sheer incomprehensible force being projected from this mysterious crucifix into the vessel that was Sister Nora. What was she to do now? Sister Nora was right from the very start. She was stuck here. She had no one to check up on her well-being. Her friends had long since forgotten about her since her parents' funeral. They hadn't even called to see her before she was sent to the orphanage. She scoffed. Some friends they were, she said aloud. The way she saw it, she only had a few options at her disposal, but none of them were optimal. Catherine dragged herself up from the floor and paced the room as she weighed up her options. I could wait until everyone in the orphanage goes to bed for the night, pack my bag, and run away. I could leave all this horror behind me and start fresh somewhere, she muttered under her breath. But then what? Where would I go? Nobody will believe the extravagant tales of an orphan, especially when the story seems too far-fetched to be true. And who could blame them? If I wasn't living this nightmare myself, I wouldn't believe it either if someone came crying to me with stories of the devil and a cursed crucifix. She raised her hands in frustration. She had no money and minimal prospects. She would be forced to wander the cold, disease-filled streets, picking pockets to survive, unless she was fortunate enough to catch a fever and pass away. Her other option was to go to a church and try to seek sanctuary there. But given Father Michael's deception, she was wary of trusting another supposed man of God. What if there was the same evil there? What if it followed her? What would happen if Sister Nora ended up finding her? The only other option was to remain in the orphanage with Sister Nora for 3 more years, until she could leave. If she kept quiet and minded her own business, then surely it would lessen the routine torture that Sister Nora directed at her. There were always new orphans arriving, and maybe in a few days a new arrival might become fixed in Sister Nora's sights. If she was no longer on her radar, if another orphan had done worse things than she had, then the tirade would have to stop. However, this idea didn't sit well with Catherine. Her chest tightened and her stomach twisted at the thought. To have another orphan in her exact position meant she would have to act oblivious, knowing that Sister Nora would be inflicting this insane torture on someone who could end up being a lot younger and more fragile than Catherine. If she were to do this, then she would be no better than Father Michael. She shook her head in defeat. I can't do that. These children have done nothing wrong. They don't deserve to be subjected to that, Catherine muttered as she walked over to the window and gazed out. She didn't want to become as spineless as he was, especially when some of the orphans were quite young and might not be strong enough to survive the unending abuse. But to not turn a blind eye meant that she would forever be subjecting herself to bouts of sadistic torture simply because Sister Nora can, and she felt like she deserved it. Catherine's mind was frazzled with the culmination of her opposing thoughts and emotions. She kept changing from feeling sorry for herself to being angry. She was livid with her parents. Had they not died, or had they put a solid plan in place in case they died prematurely, she wouldn't even be here. She hated that her parents had been so stuck in their own little passive world of tending to the farm and going ritually to Mass that they failed to prepare for any sort of future, a future which they were now destined to no longer have, one that they denied Catherine of. Through the tears cascading down her face, Catherine managed to laugh, not out of humor or relief, but out of sheer desperation of the situation. She had no choice. That was crystal clear. She had to stay here and try to survive as best she could. She didn't wish her pain and suffering to be projected on another orphan, but she had to put herself first and watch her own back. She would have to remain invisible and wouldn't try to make friends with anyone. If Sister Nora saw that she was getting too comfortable, she couldn't guarantee the safety of those around her. Instead, she would take on extra chores to help each day pass quicker, giving her something productive to focus on, rather than the hell and immense pain of every day. She would no longer go looking for answers. She knew everything she needed to know now, and if she were to ever get that itching feeling to go deeper with that knowledge to expose the evil within the walls of the orphanage, well then, her sliced tongue and severed gum would act as a permanent reminder of what would happen to her if she were to ever disobey the word of Sister Nora again. She needed to keep in her place. That was all that mattered now. All right, guys, we'll do one last chapter. My sad dog is over here. She thought I should be done already. Right, Pepper? One more, and then we'll call it for the night. And hopefully, yeah, we're right about halfway through. So we'll plan on trying to finish this on Saturday night. So one last chapter, and here we go. 15. The weeks crawled by as winter gave way to spring, and Catherine kept to her word. She kept herself busy by taking on new chores in the scullery and being diligent in carrying them out, avoiding giving Sister Nora any reason to target her. This worked quite well for a while, but after a short period of time it seemed Sister Nora was growing tired of not having any legitimate reason to hurt Catherine. Despite her perfect behavior, on more than one occasion, she found herself back in the confines of Sister Nora's office, holding back tears as she received lash after lash from her extensive range of riding crops. No matter what she did, she couldn't escape her wrath. Every few days or so, more orphans unfortunately met their demise. It was frightening how Catherine had grown accustomed to the endless passing faces in the building. Given the sadistic pattern of the nun, seeing a face one day at dinner and having an empty spot in their assigned seat at breakfast the next morning was something that Catherine had quickly learnt to accept as normal. Father Michael had even constructed a new makeshift graveyard on the other side of the building to keep up with the disposal of the ever-increasing number of bodies. As he scuttled around the gardens, Catherine couldn't help but imagine how fast those notebooks of his must have been filling up. She had made the fatal error one morning of offering a welcoming smile to a newcomer called Rachel. She couldn't help it. Rachel's doe-like face made it impossible for her to maintain her cold, stone-like nature. Rachel returned a sheepish smile to her, and for the first time in what felt like years, Catherine felt a small stirring of warmth in her body. However, Rachel didn't appear for lunch that afternoon. Her seat remained empty. A look of puzzlement crossed Catherine's face as she looked around the room, trying to catch a glimpse of her, on the off chance that Rachel had simply chosen to sit somewhere else. She caught sight of Sister Nora at the head table with a wicked smirk on her face, twisting the crucifix in her hand as she observed Catherine's discomfort. Catherine guessed that Rachel had joined the unfortunate list of Sister Nora's victims. She knew if she were to head out into the graveyard, she would see a freshly dug hole in the ground. Father Michael was right. No matter what she did, Sister Nora would be watching her, targeting her, ensuring she and those around her would suffer excruciating pain and anguish. Anyone who came close or appeared to be friendly towards her wasn't safe. Catherine began to struggle with the idea of remaining isolated and alone until she turned 18. Her desperation became too much to handle, and her sadness began to consume her. This, of course, only seemed to lighten Sister Nora's mood. Catherine couldn't sleep without seeing images of Sister Nora's smirking face and the gleaming beacon of the crucifix invading her dreams. She stopped eating, and her eyes became deep, hollow, sunken pits in her face. She had stopped looking up altogether, afraid to meet anyone's gaze for fear that Sister Nora would interpret this as a form of camaraderie and would decide to end their time in this world. As a way of trying to cope with the insanity, to keep herself grounded and not feel so lonely, she had chosen to put all her time and energy into counting her steps. To the outsider, it may have seemed a little unorthodox, but counting her steps gave her something else to focus on other than her desperate situation. She now knew it took her precisely 471 steps to make it from her bedroom to the chapel, and 312 steps to the dining room. It had become a sort of game. Each day she wanted to lessen the number of steps it took her to reach her destination, and she felt annoyed with herself if she failed to do so. It was the only thing helping her to hold on to her sanity and to remain lucid. One Sunday afternoon, following the 12 o'clock service in the chapel, she was walking back to her dorm, her gaze fixated on her feet, counting each step as usual. As she was nearing the gravel path near the main building, a pair of worn, faded black shoes came into view and stopped her in her tracks. She tentatively looked up. She knew it couldn't be Sister Nora. She wouldn't stoop to wearing unpolished shoes. But who else would be coming to speak with her? She was surprised to see the weathered face of Sister Sorcia, the nun who had made eye contact with her on her very first day in the orphanage. She had never heard the nun speak, and she heard some of the girls mocking her because she was mute. She sidestepped the elderly nun, afraid of anyone being seen near her, but Sister Sorcia sidestepped with her, blocking her path. Catherine looked down at the gravel. She didn't know why Sister Sorcia wasn't letting her pass, but if her history with Sister Nora was anything to go by, she didn't think it wise to trust her intentions. Sister Sorcia reached down, attempting to grasp Catherine's hands, which was still puffy and cut from her last encounter with Sister Nora. Catherine glanced up at the woman and tried to move her hands behind her back, out of fear and embarrassment, but with a gentleness she wasn't expecting, the nun grabbed Catherine's wrists, stopping her from moving. Sister Sorcia didn't flinch when she saw how deep the cuts on Catherine's hands were. She pulled out a thin brown gauze, which she had concealed under the sleeve of her habit, and bound Catherine's wounds, being careful not to cause her any more pain in the process. Catherine couldn't remember the last time she had experienced such a display of kindness from someone, and couldn't help the tears which were beginning to pool in her eyes. Sister Sorcia lowered her head so she was looking straight into Catherine's eyes. Her eyes were tender and unyielding, a stark difference from the empty, dead eyes of Sister Nora. Sorcia glanced around, her head darting everywhere, checking to make sure no one was witnessing their caring exchange, and gently cupped Catherine's cheek, wiping away her tears in the process. Her hands were warm against Catherine's frozen face, and she couldn't help but lean into her touch. It was comforting to her and reminded her of the way her mother used to treat her when she was a young child. A nearby flock of crows suddenly flew over the chapel spire, startled by something. They were making a lot of noise, cawing as they went, which disrupted the tender moment. Sister Sorcia dropped her hand and stepped back. She offered Catherine a fleeting half-smile that struggled to fully reach her eyes and slowly shuffled towards the chapel as if nothing had ever happened. It was a few moments later before Catherine was able to breathe again. She hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath for the duration of their interaction. She turned around to face the direction in which Sister Sorcia had gone, in disbelief that a moment like that could happen to her here, but the nun was long gone. She raised her hand to try to savor the feeling of warmth on her cheek. Catherine kicked at a nearby stone and smiled. She didn't know how to deal with the positive feelings running through her. It was the first time she'd smiled in weeks. She shuffled her way back towards the main building. She was confused as she had never had any encounter with Sister Sorcia before, other than a quick glance. Her kindness made her feel like, at last, there was someone in the orphanage who she could turn to. Someone who may become a friend. They were both outcasts. Catherine because of her association with Sister Nora and her isolation, and Sorcia because she was different from the rest of the nuns. Being mute clearly put a barrier between her and the others. In a way, they were destined to be friends because their misery connected them. Catherine was conflicted, though. The last time she thought she could trust someone, she had been viciously attacked, causing her to lose a tooth and ending up with a grotesque sliced tongue that she would be stuck with forever. Perhaps their interaction had been a one-off moment. She almost hoped so. If Sister Nora suspected that someone was being kind to her, then both herself and that person would face her wrath. Catherine allowed herself, for a moment, to relish in the brief level of kindness she was shown. With a heavy heart, she resigned herself to the simple fact that it was just for that one time. She trudged up the steep steps and over the threshold of the door. Her newly bound hands hurt just a little less due to the bandages. She ran her hands along the wooden banister of the stairs, replaying Sister Sorcia's act of kindness in her head as she went. However, she couldn't stop the nagging feeling that someone was behind her, watching her as she moved. She was used to Sister Nora appearing from nowhere like a menacing phantom, but she still didn't want to be caught by surprise. She turned around, her heart pounding in her chest, but there was no one there. She ran back to the musty corner of the hall, right back to the banister from which she had just come. She glanced around in case someone had followed her without her knowing and had yet to make themselves known. She raced down a few steps just to make sure, but there was no one around. She went back up the few stairs which she had just come down from, clumsily tripping over the last one in the process. She had to put her hands out in front of her to stop herself from falling to the ground and hitting her face. She winced as soon as she felt the impact on her hands. The gauze wasn't thick enough to shield her hands from the pain of that. She cursed herself at her own stupidity, shaking her hands to get rid of the pain, and skulked into her bedroom. She tried to shrug off her nerves and paranoia, but couldn't shake the feeling she was being watched. She grabbed the rosary beads that were lying in a tangled heap on her desk and prayed hard for Sister Sorcia, hoping that nothing harmful would come to such a kind soul. She clasped her hands tightly together, ignoring the searing pain that was shooting up through her body. Her knuckles strained with tension, a stark contrast against her skin as she clutched them tightly. But she paid no attention. Instead, she prayed that Sister Nora hadn't seen her encounter with Sister Sorcia. If she hadn't, the nun would remain safe. She looked up to the heavens in desperation and began to repeat, "Saint Michael, the Archangel, defend us in battle. Be our protection against the wickedness and snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray. And do thou, O Prince of the heavenly host, by the power of God, thrust into hell Satan and all of the other evil spirits who prowl about the world seeking the ruinous souls. Amen." All right, ladies and gentlemen, that is where we are going to call it for the evening. We made it through 15 chapters tonight, which is a good long way into the book. Let's see. Yeah, we're just over 52 or over 50%. We're at 52%, which means we should be able to make it through the book on Saturday. So you will not be left wanting when I go on vacation and I'm not here for a week and some odd. 2 weeks? Week and a half? I think 3 reading sessions I'll be gone for. A Tuesday, a Saturday, and then a Tuesday, but I'll be back that following Saturday, I believe. So, my plan is to get through this, take a little vacation, and then we'll come back and hit the ground running again. Thank you to all of you. The greatest gift that you can give me is the gift of your time, and I appreciate that you guys gave me the gift of yours this evening, whether it was for 5 minutes or for the whole read tonight. I hope you really enjoyed this reading so far of The Crucifix by Naomi Cashman. It's been quite enjoyable for me so far. I'd like to continue to see where this goes, and we will on Saturday. As a reminder, I did record all of the chapters that we went through today, so if you missed any part of the read and want to catch up on it, you can stop out to the YouTube channel, youtube.com/@SirArminius, and listen to those chapters. I will get them uploading after the stream tonight. And if you are eager to continue the book and don't want to wait for me to have the next read of it, then you can always stop out to the author sites. What do I have for you for author sites? I know I've got them. Where are they? You can stop out to Amazon and look up The Crucifix by Naomi Cashman. You can check it out on Goodreads. You can also go to Cobh and check out the book there. All ways to be able to check it out if you don't want to wait for me to finish the read on Saturday. Again, so far, very enjoyable. Hope you guys are enjoying it too. Once again, thank you all so much. I hope you have a wonderful week ahead, and I hope to see you guys all again on Saturday, where we will continue our read of The Crucifix by Naomi Cashman, read for you by me, Tim Maloney, bringing the written word to life. Hope you enjoyed it tonight. Have a great evening, everybody. See you again soon.